My daughter stood in front of me, pointed straight at my chest, and gave me a deadline. $500,000 by morning. Her husband didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He just looked at me and said, "No delays." I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I didn't ask why. I studied their faces, the fear, the greed, the certainty that I was cornered. Then I smiled and said, "All right." 4 hours later, I was airborne. And when they came to my house the next day to collect their prize, they found only a locked door and a box. When they opened it, the screaming didn't stop. Welcome and thank you for being here. If stories like this resonate with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And before we continue, please note that certain elements have been adapted for narrative and educational clarity. Any similarities to real names or locations are coincidental, while the message stays true. My name is Elias Vance. I'm 75 years old, and for 45 of those years, I was a forensic accountant. My job was to find the truth hidden in numbers, to follow the trail of decimals and dollar signs until I found the lie they were trying to hide. I was good at it. I thought I had retired from that life. I thought the quiet of my home, a home filled with the warm ghost of my wife Rose, was the final chapter of my story. It turns out I was wrong. The final chapter had not yet been written. It began as most disasters do on an ordinary Tuesday night. I was in my study, a glass of bourbon in my hand, listening to a John Coltrane record, when the frantic, desperate pounding rattled my front door. It was not the gentle knock of a daughter visiting her father. It was the panicked summons of a criminal in crisis, and I knew with a cold certainty that had been settling in my bones for a week that it was coming. I took a deep breath, composed my face into a mask of mild fatherly concern, and opened the door. There they stood, a perfectly staged portrait of despair. My daughter Naomi, her face pale and tear-streaked, her expensive cashmere coat looking rumpled and out of place, and her husband Trevor. His tie loosened, his normally perfect hair disheveled. He was trying to look worried, but even in the dim porch light, I could see the cold, calculating cunning in his eyes. He was not a man in trouble. He was a con artist giving the performance of his life. "Daddy!" Naomi cried, rushing past me into the house and collapsing onto the sofa in a heap of fabricated sobs. "Oh, Daddy, something terrible has happened." Trevor followed her, enclosing the door behind him and running a hand through his hair with a gesture of theatrical exhaustion that he had probably practiced in the car. "Elias," he said, his voice a low, urgent whisper that was meant to convey both fear and a man-to-man confidentiality. "I am so sorry to come here like this so late, but we're in trouble. Serious trouble." I played my part. I had been rehearsing for a week. "What is it? What's wrong?" I asked, my voice filled with the appropriate amount of alarm. I walked over to Naomi and sat beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. She flinched almost imperceptibly at my touch, a small telling detail that the forensic accountant in my mind filed away. Trevor began to pace the room, a caged animal in a tailored suit, and he began to weave his tale. It was a masterpiece of deceit, a story full of vague business terms and shadowy unnamed figures, all designed to sound plausible to a layman while being impossible to verify. He spoke of a once-in-a-lifetime commercial real estate deal, a syndicate of private equity partners, and an unforeseen market fluctuation. "It was a sure thing, Elias," he said, his eyes wide with feigned sincerity, a look I had seen 1,000 times across boardroom tables from men who were about to go to prison. "A guaranteed 20% return in 6 months. I put everything we had into it. I even leveraged some capital from my partners to maximize the return." "And what happened?" I asked, my voice a quiet prompt feeding him his cue. "My main partner. He's not a good man, Elias," Trevor said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. "He's connected. The kind of man you don't say no to. The market dipped last week just for a day, but it was enough to trigger a margin call. He's calling in the entire debt. He says I misled him. He's accusing me of fraud." The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. He was using the actual name of his crime fraud as the central lie of his story. It was a bold, arrogant move. "He wants his money back." Trevor continued his pacing, becoming more agitated, his performance reaching its crescendo. "All of it. $500,000. Naomi let out a pained, perfectly timed sob from the couch. "And he wants it tomorrow, Daddy," she whispered through her tears. "He told Trevor that if he doesn't have the full amount in cash by noon tomorrow, he's going to..." She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with a grief that was entirely for herself. "He's going to ruin me, Elias." Trevor finished, his voice grim. "Professionally and physically. These aren't the kind of people you can reason with. They don't file lawsuits, they make problems disappear." It was a good performance. A very good performance. They had rehearsed it. The desperate husband, the terrified wife, the shadowy, violent threat. It was a script designed to bypass reason and go straight for the heart of a protective and supposedly naive old father. They were counting on my love for my daughter to blind me to the gaping amateurish holes in their story. They had no idea that I was not just watching their play. I was auditing it, and I had already read the ending. I listened, my face a carefully constructed mask of fatherly concern, as Trevor continued to weave his elaborate tapestry of lies. He was good. I had to admit it. His story was a symphony of half-truths and outright fictions composed in a key of desperate urgency. He spoke of hard moneylenders and ironclad deadlines, painting himself as a noble but naive gladiator thrown into a den of financial lions. Naomi provided the chorus, her perfectly timed sobs and whispered pleas for help, underscoring every beat of his frantic narrative. I played my part, nodding in all the right places, my expression a mixture of shock and dawning horror. "My godson," I said, my voice trembling with a feigned frailty. "How did you get mixed up with people like this?" "I was stupid, Elias," he said, running a hand through his hair, a gesture of a man at the end of his rope. "I was ambitious. I saw a chance to secure our future, to give Naomi the life she deserves. I trusted the wrong people. It was a sure thing." A sure thing. The phrase was a spark, an unexpected flash of light that ignited a long-dormant memory. Suddenly, I was no longer in my living room in the year 2025. I was back in my kitchen 5 years ago. The air was warm and smelled of the coffee Rose was brewing. It was late, and she and I were having one of our quiet late-night talks. Naomi had just announced her engagement to Trevor a week before. I had been delighted. I saw him as a young, ambitious man who adored my daughter. But Rose was a nurse. She had a professional's ability to see past the charming bedside manner to the vital signs beneath. "I don't trust him, Elias," she had said, her voice quiet but firm as she poured 2 mugs of coffee. I had been taken aback. "Rosie, what are you talking about? He's a wonderful young man. He's smart, he's ambitious, and he clearly loves our daughter." "He's too smooth," she had said, looking out the kitchen window into the darkness. "His answers are too perfect. It's like he's always selling something. When you ask him a question, he doesn't give you an answer. He gives you a presentation." I had laughed, trying to dismiss her concerns. "You're being too hard on him. That's just how men in his line of work talk. He's a financial consultant. They're all salesmen." "No," she had insisted, turning to face me, her eyes full of a deep, unshakable seriousness that I had foolishly ignored. "It's more than that. I asked him about his family, and he gave me a 3-minute perfectly polished story about his hard-working father in the coal mines of West Virginia. It was a beautiful story, but it wasn't a memory. It was a script. There was no real emotion behind it. It was hollow. "Daddy, you have to trust us." Naomi's voice, pleading and desperate, ripped me from the past and threw me back into the cold, hard reality of my living room. She was on her knees in front of me now, her hands clutching mine, her face a mess of tears and mascara. "You're the only one who can help us." I looked down at her, at the daughter my wife had loved so fiercely, and all I could hear was Rose's quiet, prophetic voice from that night in the kitchen. "There's no such thing as a sure thing, Elias," she had told me as she placed the warm mug of coffee in my hands. "Only a good con man can make you believe there is." I had trusted him, and in doing so, I had not trusted the one person in the world whose judgment, whose intuition I should have valued above all others, my wife. The irony was a bitter, choking pill. She had seen the predator, and I, in my foolish fatherly optimism, had only seen the charming suitor. My past naivety had helped pave the road to this very moment. This disaster was not just theirs. A small, terrible part of it was mine. And in that moment, my resolve, which had been a cold, hard thing, was tempered with a new burning fire. I was no longer just a man seeking justice. I was a husband seeking to honor the wisdom of the wife he had failed. I looked at Trevor, who was standing by the fireplace, the very picture of a man wronged by a cruel world. He was still talking, still selling his fiction. And now they're threatening to ruin me, to take everything we've built. He was a ghost, a hollow man, just as Rose had said. And I, the man who had dismissed her concerns, was now the sole audience for his final desperate performance. The father in me was still in that kitchen 5 years ago, wishing he had listened. But the forensic accountant, the man who had been trained for 45 years to see the patterns in the numbers, to find the truth in a mountain of lies, was here in this room, and he knew exactly what he was looking at. He was looking at a man who had finally fatally run out of other people's money. I let the weight of their story settle in the room, a thick, suffocating blanket of lies. I played the part of the overwhelmed father, a man stunned into a state of shocked silence. I looked at my daughter, her face a mess of performative tears. I looked at her husband, his expression a careful construction of fear and desperation. The forensic accountant in my mind was already flagging the inconsistencies, the red flags that were waving in every corner of their flimsy narrative. But the father, the character I was now playing, had to be convinced. I cleared my throat, my voice a weak, trembling thing. "Okay," I stammered, running a hand over my face. "Okay, let me just try to understand this. $500,000. In cash. Trevor, how does one even get that much cash on such short notice?" "My bank. They'll have to file a federal report for any withdrawal over $10,000. It will raise questions, and carrying that much money across the city, my godson, it's incredibly dangerous." It was a simple, logical question, a practical problem, but it was also a test. Trevor, the master performer, didn't miss a beat. He had rehearsed this. "That's the point, Elias," he said, his voice a low, urgent whisper. "These aren't official people. They don't want a paper trail. They don't want federal reports. They operate in the shadows. Cash is the only way to make this problem disappear cleanly and finally. It's the only language they speak." His answer was smooth, designed to heighten the sense of illicit danger, to make me feel that the normal rules of the world did not apply here. The accountant in my mind made a quiet note. Classic conman tactic number 1. Create a sense of urgency and secrecy to bypass normal procedures. I pressed on, my voice still full of a manufactured fatherly concern. "But there must be some paperwork," I insisted, looking from Trevor to Naomi. "An agreement, a contract, something that proves this debt is real, that outlines the terms. Before I liquidate my entire life savings, I need to see something in writing. My lawyer, Charlie Evans, he would have my hide if I didn't." This question, this appeal to logic and legal process, was a direct threat to their narrative, and it was Naomi who jumped in to neutralize it, her voice rising with a new wave of perfectly timed hysteria. "Daddy, no," she cried, grabbing my arm. "There's no time for lawyers. This was a handshake deal. Don't you understand? If we get lawyers involved, if we start asking for paperwork, they'll see it as a betrayal. They'll think we're going to the police. They'll get angry. They'll come after him, after us." Trevor nodded grimly, backing her play. "She's right, Elias. In their world, calling a lawyer is the same as calling the cops. It would be a death sentence. Please, you have to trust us. This is a family matter. It has to be handled within the family." And there it was. Tactic number 2, isolate the mark, frame outside help as a dangerous threat. They were not just lying, they were following a script as old as greed itself, a script I had seen in 100 different case files over the years. They were building a cage of fear and urgency around me, and they expected me to be too panicked to see the bars. I let out a long, shuddering sigh, a sound of a man being overwhelmed, of a father's logic being drowned by his fear for his child. I looked at my daughter's terrified, pleading face. It was a brilliant performance. It truly was. "Okay," I whispered, the picture of a defeated old man. "Okay, no lawyers. I understand." I had let them win the argument. I had let them believe they had successfully navigated my final feeble objections, and now they were confident, they were in control, and they were ready for the final killing blow. I had played my part, the hesitant, concerned father, pointing out the logical flaws in their desperate, flimsy story. I had tested the lie and found it to be as hollow as I knew it was. Now it was time for them to make their final move. I had presented them with the reality of the situation, that liquidating a lifetime of savings takes time, that the world of finance operates on rules and schedules. I had given them the truth, and I waited to see how they would react to it. Their reaction was not one of understanding or of problem-solving. It was one of pure, unadulterated rage. The mask of the grateful, desperate couple dissolved, And for the first time that night, I saw the true ugly faces of the people who had invaded my home. Penalties. Naomi repeated the word as if it were a personal insult, her voice losing its tearful little girl quality and becoming sharp and brittle. Daddy, are you serious right now? Trevor is talking about men who will physically hurt him, and you are worried about capital gains taxes. It's not that simple, my dear, I said, my voice a portrait of weary paternal patience. This isn't a checking account, it's a portfolio, an entire structure I built over 40 years. To dismantle it in a single day, it's not just about penalties. It's about market hours and settlement periods. It's not possible to have $500,000 in liquid cash by noon tomorrow. A day, maybe two at the earliest. 2 days, Trevor said, and his voice, which had been so full of manufactured gratitude just moments before, was now a low, dangerous growl. He stood up from his chair, no longer the slumped, defeated victim, but a coiled spring of aggressive impatience. Elias, I told you, these people, they want their money tomorrow. At noon. There is no 2 days. That is not an option. It was fascinating in a cold, clinical sort of way. I was a historian watching a negotiation devolve into a shakedown in real time. They had used the fiction of fear to try and manipulate me. Now that I had in principle agreed to their demand, their own manufactured fear was gone, and only the raw, ugly engine of their greed remained. They were no longer asking for a favor. They were demanding a transaction be completed on their impossible schedule, and my real-world concerns were nothing more than an intolerable annoyance. What am I supposed to do, Trevor? I asked, my voice a perfect picture of helpless frustration. I can't print the money. I have to call my broker. The markets have to open. The trades have to be executed. This is the real world. Naomi stood up, then her brief performance of the kneeling, pleading daughter, now a forgotten scene from a play that had reached its angry climax. She looked down at me, her father, the man who had just in theory agreed to sacrifice his entire financial future to save her and her husband. And her expression was not one of gratitude. It was one of pure, unadulterated contempt. I was no longer her father, her protector, her rock. I was a slow, inefficient, and deeply frustrating bank teller who was making her wait in line. Daddy, that is not our problem, she said, her voice flat, cold, and utterly devoid of emotion. That is your problem. You have to figure it out. You said you would help. This is what help looks like. It's not a 2-day process. It's a right-now process. She began to pace in front of me, a mirror of Trevor's earlier performance, but her agitation was not feigned. It was real. It was the agitation of a spoiled child whose every whim had not been instantly gratified. Call your broker now, she commanded. Wake him up. Tell him it's a life-or-death emergency. Tell him to be at the bank with the paperwork at 9 a.m. sharp. Tell him you'll pay whatever penalties there are. I don't care what you have to do. Get it done. The cruelty of it, the absolute lack of empathy for the monumental sacrifice she was demanding, was a physical blow. But the performance wasn't over. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment I knew would come, the moment they would push too far, the moment they would make their demand so explicit, so unreasonable, so monstrously selfish that no one on earth, not a single person in a future jury box, could ever see them as the victims. I looked up at her, my face a carefully constructed mask of a father's pain. Naomi, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Please, try to understand. But she was not speaking to her father anymore. She was speaking to her bank, and her account was overdrawn. She took a step closer, her face contorted with a rage that was terrifying in its purity. She pointed a finger at me, a gesture of such profound, shocking disrespect that it felt as if she had physically struck me. I don't want to hear it, she snapped, her voice rising to a near shout. I don't want to hear about your broker or your penalties or your process. You said you would handle it, so handle it. I need the money tomorrow. Trevor stood up, moving to stand beside her, a silent, menacing pillar of support for her tirade. He was no longer her husband. He was her enforcer. He looked down at me, his eyes as cold and dead as a shark's. And no delays. He added, his voice a low, threatening growl that was meant to be the final intimidating word. And there it was, the final naked demand. Not a request, but an order. Not a plea for help, but a threat. They were no longer pretending to be victims. They were robbers, and I was the mark. They had stripped away the last thin veneer of family and love, revealing the ugly transactional truth of their relationship with me. The forensic accountant in my mind made a final silent note. The demand. Motive absolute entitlement. The belief that my assets are their property. The crime is no longer the fraud committed against others. It is now an active attempt at extortion against me. I looked up at their faces flushed with the righteousness of their own greed. I looked at my daughter's finger still pointing at me like a weapon. I looked at the man who had taught her to be this way. And in that moment, in the face of their absolute monstrous selfishness, I felt a profound and terrible peace. The last of my doubts, the last of my fatherly hesitations were burned away in the heat of their cruelty. They had given me the final piece of evidence I needed. They had given me the moral authority to do what had to be done. The father in me was finally, truly dead. And the man who was left was simply a witness, a historian, and now a judge. The final naked demand hung in the air between us, an ugly, brutal monument to their greed. I need the money tomorrow, and no delays. They stood over me, a united front of intimidation and entitlement, their faces flushed with the righteousness of their own desires. They were waiting for me to break, to argue, to weep. They were expecting a fight. I gave them a surrender instead. I let the silence stretch, filling the room with the sound of the old clock ticking on the mantelpiece, each second a hammer blow of decision. I looked from my daughter's furious, demanding face to her husband's cold, predatory eyes. I saw no love there, no family. I saw only a business transaction, and I was the asset being liquidated. The historian in me, the part that had been so coldly analyzing their every move, stepped back, and for one final brilliant moment, the actor took the stage. I let my shoulders slump. I let the look of a lifetime of weariness settle upon my features. I looked up at them, my eyes full of a carefully crafted sadness, the look of a man who had been utterly and completely defeated, a king who had just been forced to sign away his kingdom. And then I smiled. It was not a real smile. It was a weak, tired, broken thing, a fragile imitation of warmth. It was the smile of a man who has given up the fight. Okay. I whispered the word, a barely audible breath of capitulation. Okay. I raised my hands in a small gesture of surrender. I'll figure it out. I'll call my broker. The money will be ready for you. Tomorrow. The change in the room was instantaneous, a physical shift in the atmosphere so sudden it was almost violent. The thick, cloying tension of their aggression did not just ease. It burst, flooding the space with a wave of palpable, giddy relief. Trevor, who had been a coiled spring of menace, physically deflated. He let out a long, whooshing breath and sank back into the armchair, a triumphant, exhausted grin spreading across his face. "See," he said, his voice no longer a growl but a smooth, satisfied purr. "I knew you'd do the right thing, Elias. I knew you wouldn't let us down." Naomi's transformation was even more stunning. The angry pointing finger dropped. The furious mask on her face melted away, replaced by a dazzling smile of pure, victorious joy. She rushed forward and threw her arms around me in a hug that was utterly, completely false. "Oh, Daddy!" She squealed, her voice now the cheerful, loving chirp of the daughter she had been pretending to be. "Thank you, thank you. I knew you wouldn't let us down. You're our hero." I did not hug her back. I simply sat there, a statue of defeat, and let her perform her final act of gratitude. She pulled away, her eyes shining with the thrill of her victory. They saw my surrender, my broken smile, my weary agreement, and they believed it completely. They had no idea that my okay was not an answer to their demand. It was not an act of surrender. It was a verdict. It was the first word of their eulogy, and they were so busy celebrating they hadn't even heard the bell toll. My whispered okay was the final nail. The coffin of my old life, my old relationship with my daughter, was sealed shut with that single defeated word. They left my house not with the quiet gratitude of people who had been saved, but with the boisterous, triumphant energy of victors leaving a conquered city. As soon as I gave my final broken agreement, the atmosphere in my living room transformed. The air, which had been thick with their manufactured despair, suddenly became light and celebratory. Trevor clapped his hands together, a sharp cracking sound that made me flinch. "Fantastic!" He boomed, his voice no longer a desperate whisper but the hearty roar of a successful CEO closing a major deal. That's settled then. We'll be here at noon tomorrow to pick up the check. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. He was already giving me my orders. Naomi, my daughter, rushed to her husband's side, her face flushed with victory. She looped her arm through his, the two of them, a united front of smug satisfaction. The tear-streaked, terrified woman who had been kneeling at my feet just moments before was gone, replaced by a cool, confident socialite who had just secured her funding. She turned to me, her smile bright and utterly devoid of warmth. "Thank you, Daddy," she said, her tone the same one she might use to thank a waiter for refilling her water glass. "You really came through for us. For a minute there I was worried you were going to be difficult." The condescension in that last word was a final twisting turn of the knife. I wasn't a person who had just sacrificed his life savings for them. I was a potential obstacle that had been successfully managed. They moved towards the door, a whirlwind of renewed energy and grand plans. Their conversation was no longer about shadowy loan sharks or physical threats. It was about the future, a future they now believed was secure, a future built upon the ruins of my own. "First thing we do after we pay these guys off is call the realtor," I heard Trevor say as he pulled on his expensive coat. "That place on Lake Norman isn't going to stay on the market forever. With this little debt issue cleared up, our credit will be clean enough to get the mortgage." So that was the plan. The $500,000 wasn't just to fill the hole in their Ponzi scheme. It was to clear their slate so they could take on even more debt to finance an even bigger lie. My life savings were not a bailout. They were a down payment on their next fraud. "And we absolutely have to rebook that trip to the Amalfi Coast," Naomi added, checking her reflection in the hall mirror and fluffing her hair. "We've earned it after all this stress. A month, I think. We can work remotely from the villa." They spoke as if I wasn't even there, as if I were a piece of furniture, a silent witness to their casual cruelty. They had no shame. They had no gratitude. They had only a bottomless, ravenous appetite for more. As they reached the door, Naomi paused and turned back to me one last time. "Try to get some rest, Daddy," she said, her voice a perfect imitation of a caring daughter. "You look exhausted. And please don't worry. We'll pay you back. Someday." The lie was so effortless, so casual, it was almost an afterthought. It was a final, dismissive pat on the head for the foolish old man they had so successfully manipulated. She had no intention of ever paying me back. We both knew it. Then they were gone. The front door closed with a quiet click, shutting out the sound of their cheerful, excited chatter as they walked to their car. I heard the engine of the Range Rover roar to life, a sound of power and privilege, and then they were gone, speeding off into the night to celebrate their victory. I stood alone in the silence of my living room. I walked to the window and watched their taillights disappear down the street. They were completely and utterly convinced that they had won. They had come to me with a problem, and they had left with a solution. They never once saw the emptiness in my eyes, the cold, dead calm that had settled in my heart. They saw a weak, grieving, sentimental old fool, and they had played me like a fiddle. They had no idea that they hadn't been playing me. They had been playing themselves. They had spent the entire evening describing in meticulous detail the cage they were in, and then they had handed me the key. I looked at the clock on the mantelpiece, the one Rose had loved so much. It was almost midnight. I had a lot of work to do, and not much time to do it. The war was not over. It had just begun. As the sound of their car faded into the night, a profound and heavy silence settled over my house. They were gone, speeding off to celebrate their victory, completely secure in the knowledge that they had won, that the foolish, sentimental old man had crumbled just as they had predicted. They believed the game was over. They had no idea that the real game, my game, had begun a week ago, not in my living room, but under the cold marble countertop of their own kitchen. My mind went back to that moment, the true beginning of this whole sordid affair. It had started as so many great and terrible stories do, with a simple mundane task, a leaky faucet. Naomi had called me her voice, a familiar blend of affection and frustration. "Daddy, the sink is dripping again, and it's driving me insane. Trevor is swamped with a big deal, and I can't get a plumber out here for a week. Could you possibly come take a look?" Of course I had said yes. I arrived at their magnificent cold house, my old toolbox in hand. They were rushing out the door just as they had been the night I found the evidence. A charity luncheon this time. They were always on their way to some important performative event. I was left alone in the sterile, silent kitchen, the only sound the steady, rhythmic drip, drip, drip from the designer faucet. It was the sound of a small, persistent flaw in an otherwise perfect facade. I got down on my old knees and opened the cabinet doors beneath the sink. It was a dark, cluttered space. I had to move a jumble of expensive organic cleaning supplies to get to the pipes. In the back, there was a precarious stack of plastic takeout containers. As I tried to shift them, the entire stack came tumbling down, scattering across the kitchen floor. And there in the space they had been hiding was a sleek, expensive laptop and a thick black leather-bound ledger. The ledger was the first red flag. In my 45 years as a forensic accountant, I had learned that men who still kept physical books in a digital age were men with secrets. I hesitated for a moment. This was my daughter's home. My professional life was over. It was not my place to pry. But then I looked around the vast, empty kitchen at the ridiculously expensive Sub-Zero refrigerator and the Wolf range that looked like it had never been used. I thought of my daughter, who had never earned more than a modest salary in her life, living in a multi-million-dollar home. And I thought of my wife, Rose, and her quiet, unshakable intuition. "He's too smooth, Elias," she had always said about Trevor. "His stories don't have roots." My professional instinct, a beast I thought had long since gone dormant, overpowered the fatherly reluctance. I reached in and pulled out the ledger. I opened it. And the world as I knew it ended. It was a list of names, and next to each name, a number. I recognized the names: Henderson, Abernathy, Morgan. These were our friends, people who had come to our house for Christmas parties, people who had held my daughter in their arms when she was a baby. The numbers next to their names were large: 50,000, 100,000, 75,000. It was an investor list. I flipped the page. Disbursements. It was a sickening catalog of their life. Range Rover down payment, $70,000. Amalfi Coast vacation, $20,000. Custom suits T, Hayes, $10,000. He was spending their money, our friends' money. My mind, cold and analytical, began to put the pieces together. I flipped to the back of the book, searching for the bottom line, and I found it. Capital inflow versus outflow. The final brutal calculation, a deficit of $500,000. It was a Ponzi scheme. Classic, simple, and utterly monstrous. I felt a wave of dizziness so profound I had to grip the edge of the marble countertop to keep from falling. The victims were not just names. They were the faces of my friends, the people who had trusted my daughter's husband because he was my daughter's husband. He had used my name, my reputation, as the key to unlock their life savings. And my daughter was living in the proceeds of the crime. I needed more. I needed irrefutable proof. I opened the laptop. It was not password protected. Arrogance. The desktop had a single folder on it labeled Clients. I clicked it open. It was a digital blueprint of his entire criminal enterprise. There were fraudulent account statements showing impossible returns, and there was a master spreadsheet. It had a column for the investors' ages. Most were over 70, and it had a column of notes. Henderson recently widowed. Abernathy sold family business. It was a predator's playbook. The father in me was screaming, but the accountant took over. I took out my phone. My hands were shaking, but my movements were precise. I took clear, high-resolution photos of every single page in that ledger. I photographed every fraudulent statement on the laptop, every line of that damning spreadsheet. I documented everything. Then I put it all back. The laptop, the ledger, the takeout containers. I made the crime scene look untouched. I did not fix the faucet. I left it there, a quiet, insistent witness. Drip, drip, drip. And so when they had walked into my house that night with their desperate theatrical performance and their story of shadowy loan sharks, I was not a shocked and grieving father. I was a fully briefed witness for the prosecution. The play they were performing was for an audience of one, and that audience had already read the final tragic act. He had just been waiting for the actors to take the stage. The clock on the mantelpiece, the one Rose had loved so much, read 1:15 midnight when Charlie's car pulled silently into my driveway. He didn't knock. I had left the door unlocked for him, a silent invitation into the war room that my quiet suburban home had become. He entered like a shadow, his face grim in the dim light of the hallway, carrying a heavy-looking leather briefcase that I knew contained not just legal pads, but a portable scanner, encrypted hard drives, and 2 pairs of latex gloves. He was no longer just my friend, the retired lawyer who I played chess with on Thursdays. He was my partner, my consigliere, my co-conspirator in an act of necessary and terrible justice. "Are you ready for this, Elias?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that seemed to fill the quiet of my living room. He looked at my face, searching for any sign of hesitation of a father's weakening resolve in the face of the final definitive act. "I am," I said, my own voice steady, the actor's performance of the broken father now completely gone, replaced by the cold, clear focus of the forensic accountant. "They left me no other choice. They made the demand." "Good," he said, giving a single sharp nod. "Because once we begin, we are crossing a line. We are moving from knowledge to action. There is no turning back from this." He walked not to the living room, but to my kitchen table, the place that had been the heart of my family for 40 years. He placed his briefcase on the warm oak and clicked it open. The interior was not filled with the clutter of an ordinary briefcase. It was a neat, organized, and professional kit. He laid out his tools with the practiced precision of a surgeon. "You have the photos?" he asked, pulling on the first latex glove with a soft snapping sound. I nodded, took out my phone, and placed it on the table. "Every page of the ledger, every file on the laptop, high resolution. The metadata is all intact." "Excellent," he said, pulling on the second glove. "Let's get to work. We are going to build a fortress, Elias. A legal fortress so strong, so airtight that by the time they realize they are inside it, the doors will have been sealed for a week." For the next 4 hours, my quiet, warm kitchen, a place of 1,000 happy memories, was transformed into a sterile, silent evidence processing lab. We did not speak of our feelings. We did not speak of Naomi or of Rose. We spoke only of the task at hand, our conversation a low, professional murmur of technical terms and strategic planning. "Okay," Charlie began, connecting my phone to a small, black encrypted hard drive. "I'm transferring the image files now. We're not putting this on any computer that's connected to the internet. This drive will be our master copy, our original evidence. We'll make 2 working copies from it, one for the authorities and one for the box." I watched as the progress bar on his laptop screen slowly filled. It felt like I was watching my own life's blood being drained away and stored in a cold digital vault. Each photograph that was copied was a final severing act. Once the transfer was complete, Charlie began the meticulous process of building the case. He was no longer my friend. He was the prosecutor I had seen him be in the courtroom decades ago, a brilliant, ruthless architect of facts. "First," he said, pulling up a crystal-clear image of the first page of Trevor's handwritten ledger, "we have this, the Rosetta Stone. Elias, in a digital age, a physical ledger like this is a gift from the gods of prosecution. It's a tangible confession. We have his handwriting. We have the names of the victims. There is no denying its authenticity. He can't claim he was hacked. He can't claim a virus corrupted the file. This," he said, tapping the screen, "is his own hand meticulously documenting his own crime. To a jury, this is the smoking gun." He saved the file into a folder he labeled in neat block letters, "Exhibit A, the Ledger." "Next," he said, clicking to a new file. A side-by-side comparison appeared on the screen. On the left was the fraudulent account statement he had been emailing to Mrs. Henderson. It showed her initial $100,000 investment having grown to a healthy $115,000. On the right was the photograph of the master spreadsheet on his laptop, showing her real balance was just a few $1,000s. "This is where we prove intent to deceive," Charlie explained, his voice a cold clinical lecture. "It's one thing for an investment to go bad. It's another thing entirely to lie about it consistently and in writing. Each one of these emails, each one of these fake statements is a separate count of wire fraud. We have a dozen victims, which means we have dozens of counts." He wasn't just losing their money. He was actively and repeatedly lying to their faces to conceal the theft. This tells a story of a calculated, long-term deception. He saved the files into a new folder, Exhibit B, Acts of Fraud. He then moved to the spreadsheet itself, zooming in on the column of notes, the predator's playbook. Recently widowed, living on a fixed income, needs supplemental income for medical bills. Charlie's voice, which had been clinical, now became tight with a contained rage. "And this Elias," he said, his voice dropping to a low growl, This is what will destroy him in court. This is what will make a jury hate him. This isn't just a white-collar criminal. This is a predator who specifically targeted the weakest members of the herd. This moves the crime from the financial pages to the front page. A prosecutor won't just see this as fraud. They will see it as a hate crime against the elderly. There is no sympathy for a man who does this. None. He saved the final damning spreadsheet. Exhibit C, evidence of predatory targeting. The fortress was being built brick by damning brick. He worked in a focused silence for a long time, copying, labeling, and organizing. The only sounds were the quiet clicking of his laptop keys and the steady rhythmic drip of the still unrepaired faucet from my daughter's kitchen, a sound that now seemed to be echoing in my own home. Drip, drip, drip. The sound of their world slowly, steadily bleeding out. Finally, he was done. He had 2 identical encrypted USB drives in his hand. One was labeled SEC. The other was labeled simply The Box. He placed the SEC drive into the handsome leather briefcase. The other he left on the table. "It's all there," he said, the adrenaline of the work finally fading, leaving behind a profound weariness. "A complete, verified, and duplicated record of their entire criminal enterprise. It's more than enough. This isn't just a slam dunk, Elias. This is a case that will make headlines." He began to carefully pack his equipment away. The scanner, the hard drives, all of it disappeared back into his briefcase. He wiped down my phone with a microfiber cloth. He was erasing our own tracks, a final act of professional caution. The first hint of dawn was beginning to lighten the sky outside. Our 4 hours were up. The evidence had been gathered. The case had been built. The trap was now officially set. We had come into this night as a father and his friend. We were emerging from it as the silent, unseen architects of a just and necessary reckoning. All that was left was for the guilty parties to arrive and claim their prize. The work with Charlie was done. The clock on the mantelpiece read 3:00 a.m. In the 4 hours since Naomi and Trevor had left my house, a quiet but profound revolution had taken place. The evidence from my phone had been copied, encrypted, and organized into a fortress of irrefutable facts. The chaotic, ugly secret I had discovered under my daughter's kitchen sink was now a clean, orderly, and absolutely devastating legal case. Now it was time to prepare the final delivery. On my kitchen table, the warm oak surface where Rose and I had shared 40 years of meals, we laid out the 2 sets of printed documents. 2 identical stacks of black and white paper, each one a monument to my daughter's and her husband's greed. "This one," Charlie said, tapping the first stack, "is for the authorities. It needs to be perfect, clean, organized, and undeniable." He worked with the meticulous, ordered precision of a man who had spent his life bringing order to the chaos of human malfeasance. From his briefcase, he produced a series of professional legal-grade evidence folders. He began to sort the documents into categories, his movements economical and precise. He was not just organizing papers, he was building a cage out of facts and statutes. Each labeled folder was another iron bar. "Exhibit A, the ledger," he murmured, sliding the scanned pages of Trevor's handwritten confession into the first folder. "The smoking gun, a prosecutor's dream." "Exhibit B, acts of fraud." He continued, gathering the dozens of counterfeit account statements. "This demonstrates the pattern, the deliberate long-term deception." "Exhibit C, evidence of predatory targeting," he said, his voice hardening as he handled the spreadsheet with its list of elderly victims and their vulnerabilities. "This is what will remove any shred of sympathy from the jury." Finally, he took the printout of the email about the Cayman Islands. "And Exhibit D, intent to flee. This shows it wasn't a mistake. It was a heist." He placed all the folders in their perfect damning order into a handsome, sturdy leather briefcase. It looked official, important, and final. It was a weapon of pure, cold, impartial law. It was an instrument of the state. While he worked on his, I began to prepare the second box. Mine was not a briefcase. I had gone into my garage earlier and found a simple, plain cardboard box, the kind that might be used for packing away old clothes or forgotten memories. It was anonymous, unassuming. It was a box for a personal delivery, an instrument of the Father. I took my own identical set of the printed evidence. I did not sort it into legal categories. I simply held the thick, heavy stack in my hands. It felt like a tombstone. It was heavy with the weight of lies, of betrayal, of a dozen ruined retirements. It was the full, undiluted truth of what they had done. I placed it squarely in the bottom of the cardboard box. This was the foundation of their new reality. Next, I went to my desk. From a locked drawer, I took out the 2 items I had prepared. The first was the bus ticket. It looked so flimsy, so insignificant, a pathetic scrap of paper in the face of such a monumental crime. A single one-way ticket on a Greyhound bus departing from Charlotte the next afternoon. The destination, a small, forgotten coal mining town in the hills of West Virginia. The town where Trevor had been born, the town he had spent his entire life clawing his way out of. It was a ticket back to the beginning, to a life of hard work and honest poverty. It was a path to a different kind of life, a life of humility, of starting over from nothing. It was, I knew, a foolish gesture, a father's last desperate act of hope. She would see it as an insult, a final act of condescension. She would tear it to pieces. But I had to put it in. I had to offer the off-ramp, the final narrow door of escape, so that when she chose the path of ruin, she would be doing so with the full knowledge of the honest life she had so contemptuously refused. The final item was the letter. I had written it after my phone call with Charlie, the words coming to me with a sad, terrible clarity. It was not a letter of anger. It was a letter of consequences. I unfolded it one last time. My dearest Naomi, if you are reading this, then you have found your inheritance. It is not the $500,000 you demanded, it is the truth. A truth you have avoided for a very long time. The papers in this box are a complete record of the crimes you and your husband have committed. They are a duplicate of a set that is, as you read this, on its way to the federal authorities. I did not do this to hurt you. I did this because I had no other choice. I did this because the father in me, the man who would do anything to protect his little girl, had to finally step aside and let the man your mother married, the man who believes in right and wrong, do what was necessary. I discovered your crime. I saw the names of our oldest friends on a list of victims. And in that moment, I was faced with a choice to protect your crime or to protect your mother's legacy. I chose her. And the man you performed for in my living room, the weak, defeated old man who agreed to give you his life savings, was a lie. He was a role I played to give you the opportunity to show me who you had truly become. And you did not disappoint. You showed me a cruelty and an entitlement that I did not recognize. You showed me a stranger. This is not a punishment, Naomi. It is a reckoning. The bus ticket is a symbolic choice. It is a path to a simple, honest life, the kind of life your mother and I built. I do not expect you to take it, but I had to offer it. The father in me had to offer it. This is the last letter I will ever write to you. The man who loved the little girl you once were is gone. He died in my living room last night. The man who is left can only offer you the truth, and the truth is now in your hands. Do with it what you will. Goodbye, Dad. I folded the letters and placed it on top of the bus ticket, which in turn rested on the cold, hard proof of their crimes. I looked at the contents of the box, the evidence, the ticket, the letter. It was a complete and final judgment. I sealed the box with heavy packing tape, the sound ripping through the silence of the house. Each strip of tape was a final severing act. The 2 packages were now complete. They sat side by side on my kitchen table in the growing light of the dawn. Charlie's leather briefcase filled with the cold, hard language of the law, and my simple cardboard box filled with the devastating personal language of the truth. One was a path to a federal prison. The other was a path to a lonely bus station. Both were a one-way ticket to the consequences they had so arrogantly believed they could outrun. The hour before my midnight flight was the quietest of my life. Charlie and I had driven to the airport in a heavy, comfortable silence. The 2 evidence packages sitting on the back seat like silent, watchful passengers. The Charlotte Douglas International Airport, usually a frantic hive of activity, had subsided into a low, melancholic hum. The crowds had thinned, leaving only the red-eye warriors and the weary travelers waiting for the last connections of the night. It felt like a place between worlds, a fitting departure point for the journey I was about to take. We found the gate for my one-way flight to New York. It was at the far end of the concourse, quiet, almost deserted. We sat in the stiff, uncomfortable chairs, the handsome leather briefcase at my feet, the plain cardboard box on the seat between us. For a long time, we just stared out the massive window at the blinking lights of a plane taxiing on the dark runway. "Are you sure about this, Elias?" Charlie said finally, his voice a low rumble that was barely audible over the airport's ventilation system. "There's still time to turn back. We can walk out of here right now. I can make the call to my contact at the U.S. Attorney's office in the morning. We hand over the briefcase, you get on a plane to Florida, and you wash your hands of it. You don't have to be the one to pull the trigger." It was the voice of a good and loyal friend offering one last merciful escape route, an easier path. But we both knew that the easy path was a luxury I could no longer afford. "And what would that accomplish, Charlie?" I asked, my own voice, tired but firm. "They'd be arrested. There would be a trial, and through it all they would see themselves as victims, victims of a system that caught them, victims of a father who betrayed them. They would serve their time, and they would learn nothing except perhaps how to be more careful the next time." "That's the system's job, not yours," he argued gently. "The system is there to punish, not to teach moral lessons." "But I am her father." I said the word feeling foreign in my mouth. "My job is not just to report the crime. My job is to deliver the lesson. They came to my house. They stood in my living room and performed a lie for me. They tried to make me a party to their crime. They tried to use my love for my daughter as the final tool to complete their scheme. This is not just a legal matter for me, Charlie. It is a profound personal betrayal, and the consequences must be just as personal." He sighed, a long, weary sound of a man who knew he had lost the argument but had to make it anyway. "You know what this means, right? You're not just sending her to a courthouse. You are cutting her out of your life. Forever. When she gets out, there will be nothing left between you, no anger, no love, just the scar tissue of this night. You can't come back from this, Elias." "I know," I said quietly. And I did. The father in me had already grieved that loss. The man sitting here tonight was someone else, an instrument of a different kind of justice. The daughter I knew, the little girl Rose and I raised, she's been gone for a long time. I just didn't have the courage to admit it to myself. What I am doing now is not an act of abandonment. It's an act of clarification. I am simply holding up a mirror and forcing her to see the person she has truly become. I looked at the simple cardboard box sitting between us. "That's what this is for," I said, tapping its side. "The briefcase is for the law, the box is for the lesson." "The bus ticket was a brutal touch, Elias," Charlie said, shaking his head slowly. "Even for me. It's cruel." "Is it?" I asked. "Or is it the only act of mercy I have left to give? It is a choice, a final symbolic choice. In that box she will find two paths. One is the evidence of a life of crime that will lead her to a federal court, a life of courtrooms and prison cells. The other is a bus ticket back to the small forgotten town where her husband was born, a place where people work hard for an honest living. It's a path back to a life of humility, of starting over from nothing. It is the slimmest, most improbable chance at redemption I can offer." I paused, the full, heartbreaking truth of it settling on me. I know she won't take it. Her pride, her arrogance would never allow it. But I have to offer it. The father in me needs to offer it, so that when she makes her other choice, to rage, to blame, to fight, she will be doing so with the full knowledge of the honest path she refused to take. We sat in silence again, the weight of it all settling between us. A disembodied voice echoed through the terminal announcing the pre-boarding for a flight to Dallas. "What do you think Rose would have said?" Charlie asked, his voice barely a whisper. That was the question that had haunted me for weeks, the ghost in every one of my quiet, lonely nights. I looked out at the dark runway, at the distant glittering lights of the city. I said, my voice thick with an emotion I thought I had buried. I think her heart would have broken into a million pieces. She would have wept for the daughter she loved so fiercely. But Rose was a nurse. When a wound was infected, when there was a poison in the system, she knew you couldn't just cover it with a bandage and hope for the best. She knew you had to clean it out no matter how painful it was, or the poison would spread and kill the whole body. She would have been destroyed, but she would have understood. She would have held my hand, and she would have told me to do the right thing. The automated voice came on again, this time with a calm, final authority. "Now boarding flight 1138 to New York LaGuardia at gate E14. It was time. We stood up. I picked up the heavy leather briefcase, the instrument of the law. Charlie picked up the cardboard box, the instrument of the lesson. "I'll place this on your doorstep right after you take off," he said. "It will be there waiting for them at noon." We stood facing each other, two old friends at the end of a long, dark road. In a world of lies and betrayals, his friendship had been my one true, unshakable foundation. There were no words left to say. He just pulled me into a brief, powerful hug, clapping me firmly on the back. "Be safe, Elias," he said. "You too, old friend," I replied. I took the briefcase, my shoulders squared, and I walked toward the gate, not looking back. I handed my ticket to the agent. I walked down the sterile, quiet jet bridge. Each step was heavy, final. I was walking away from my home, from my past, from the last lingering ghost of the daughter I once knew. I was walking toward a cold, clean, and necessary reckoning. After the long, grim work at my kitchen table, a new and final phase of the night began. The evidence was copied, the packages were prepared, and the first pale hints of dawn were beginning to stain the eastern sky. It was time to set the final pieces of the board. Charlie and I drove from his house, where we had gone to print the final documents, back to mine. But we did not go inside. He pulled his car to a stop across the street, the engine a low, quiet hum in the pre-dawn stillness. "This is the last stop, Elias," he said, his voice soft. "Are you ready?" I looked at my house, a dark silhouette against the lightening sky. It was a place I had not set foot in since that terrible night. "I'm ready," I said. I got out of the car. Charlie passed me the simple cardboard box from the back seat. It felt both lighter and heavier than I expected. Light because it was only paper and a key. Heavy because it was the full weight of my daughter's future. I held the box in my hands and began the last walk I would ever take up my own front path. Every step was a memory. The slight crack in the second paving stone where a young Chloe had dropped a heavy toy. The rose bush by the door, the first thing Vivian and I had ever planted together. The brass doorknob worn smooth by the touch of our hands over 40 years. This was not just a path to a house. It was a path through my entire life. I reached the porch. The rocking chair where Rose and I had spent so many summer evenings was still a silent, waiting ghost. I knelt down, my old knees protesting, and placed the cardboard box squarely on the welcome mat, a place that was meant for greeting guests, not for delivering a final, terrible judgment. I stood up and looked at the front door. For a moment I was tempted to use my key to go inside one last time, to walk through the quiet sleeping rooms and say a final goodbye. A goodbye to the ghost of my wife in her favorite armchair, a goodbye to the ghost of my little girl in her star-covered bedroom. But I knew I could not. That house was no longer my home. It was a crime scene. It was a memory. To step inside now would be to risk drowning in a past that no longer existed. So I stood there on the porch in the cold gray air of a new day, and I said my goodbyes from the outside. I said goodbye to the laughter and the tears, to the scraped knees and the first heartbreaks, to the holiday dinners and the quiet, ordinary Tuesday nights. I said goodbye to the life Vivian and I had built, a life of love and integrity that had somehow produced a daughter who understood neither. The pain of that final goodbye was a sharp physical ache in my chest. But underneath it there was a foundation of unshakable resolve. The historian in me knew that you cannot save a crumbling monument by weeping at its base. Sometimes the only way to honor its memory is to cordon it off, to document its fall, and to ensure that the truth of its history is preserved. And that is what I was doing. I reached into my pocket and took out my house key, a key I had carried for over 40 years. I looked at it for a long moment, the familiar grooves and worn edges, a map of a life I was now leaving behind. I stepped forward, inserted it into the lock of my own front door, and turned it. The sound of the deadbolt sliding home was a loud, definitive click in the morning silence. It was a sound of finality. I was not just locking a door. I was closing a chapter. I was sealing a tomb. I let go of the key, leaving it in the lock. It was no longer mine to carry. I turned my back on the house, on the box, on the ghosts of my past, and I did not look back. I walked down the stone path, my steps steady, and got back into Charlie's waiting car. The leather briefcase, the one containing the cold, hard facts for the authorities, was on the seat beside me. My mission was now in its final phase. As Charlie pulled away from the curb, I saw my house one last time in the side mirror, a quiet, respectable home on a quiet, respectable street with a simple cardboard box sitting on the porch like an ordinary, innocent delivery. It was a perfect, peaceful picture. A time bomb ticking silently in the dawn. As my plane began its final descent into the organized chaos of LaGuardia Airport, the gray morning light of New York City filling my window, I knew another more private scene was beginning on my quiet street in Charlotte. It was a scene I had directed from afar, a final act of a play that had been a week in the making. It was the scene of the victor's return. I could picture them with a historian's clarity, their movements and motives as predictable as the tides. They would have arrived at precisely noon. Not a minute before, not a minute after. Punctuality for them was not a sign of respect, but a demonstration of power. It was the punctuality of a creditor arriving to collect a debt of a new owner, arriving to take possession of a property they already believed was theirs. They would pull up to the curb, not in the white Range Rover, which I knew was now a liability they were likely trying to hide from potential creditors, but in a gleaming black Uber SUV, the kind reserved for executives and celebrities. It was a rental, of course, another temporary piece of a life lived on credit, and lies a final performance of a wealth they had not yet officially possessed, but fully inhabited in their minds. I saw them emerge from the car, two figures of dazzling, triumphant success. Trevor, my son-in-law, would be in a sharply tailored blue suit, an outfit not for a somber business meeting, but for a celebratory lunch at a Michelin-starred restaurant that would surely follow. He would look rested, confident, his face a smooth, handsome mask of a man who had faced a crisis and emerged victorious. The desperate, disheveled man who had paced my living room floor was gone, replaced by the cool, untouchable financial wizard he had always pretended to be. And Naomi, my daughter. She would be even more striking. I pictured her in a bright, stylish sundress, her hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless. She would look like a woman on her way to a garden party, not a woman whose life had been on the brink of ruin just a dozen hours earlier. They were a perfect portrait of wealth and privilege, a golden couple arriving not to beg but to claim what was rightfully theirs. They would walk up my familiar stone path with a proprietary air, as if they were already imagining putting a for sale sign on the lawn. Trevor would be carrying an expensive leather briefcase not to put money in, but presumably to carry it out. They were not expecting a difficult transaction. They were expecting a simple delivery. Their conversation as they walked would be a symphony of self-congratulation. First, stop the bank to deposit this check. I could hear Trevor saying, his voice full of a smug, easy confidence. Second, stop that new French restaurant you love for a champagne lunch. My treat. We deserve it after the stress of the last 48 hours. And then, Naomi would add, her voice a giddy whisper of excitement, we call the realtor for the Lake Norman house. I want to put in a firm offer by Monday. I've already picked out the curtains for the master bedroom. They were already spending the money. My money. The money of our friends. They were furnishing a house they did not own with the proceeds of a crime they had not yet gotten away with. Their arrogance was a thing of pure, terrifying beauty. It was a perfect, flawless diamond of self-absorption. There would be no talk of paying me back. There would be no mention of the monumental sacrifice I had supposedly made. The transaction in their minds was already complete. My life savings had simply been transferred from my column in the ledger of the world to theirs. It was a simple, and in their minds, just redistribution of wealth. I pictured them reaching the front door. Trevor, in a final act of casual ownership, would not even bother to knock. He would simply reach out and try the doorknob, expecting it to be open, expecting me to be waiting for them in the foyer like an obedient and slightly pathetic servant. The knob wouldn't turn. The door would be locked. A flicker of annoyance would cross Trevor's face. What the hell, he would mutter, rattling the knob again, a sharp, angry sound in the quiet of the morning. Did he lock it? Is he not here? Naomi would sigh, a sound of pure put-upon exasperation. She would pull out her phone. Honestly, she would say, her voice dripping with the condescension of a woman whose time is far too valuable for such minor inconveniences. He's probably in the bathroom. After last night, the old man is probably so stressed out he's having stomach problems. Just call him. Tell him his masters have arrived to collect the tribute. As Trevor began to dial my number, the number of a phone that was at that moment flying at 30,000 feet over the state of Virginia, Naomi's eyes would scan the porch, and then she would see it. Tucked away near the old rocking chair where Rose used to sit, a place of honor, now occupied by a simple, plain, and utterly unexpected object. A cardboard box. "Oh, wait," she would say, her voice brightening, the annoyance vanishing, replaced by a new, more exciting theory. "Never mind, look." Trevor would stop dialing and follow her gaze. A slow, triumphant smile would spread across his face. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated victory. "Well, what do you know?" he would say, a low, appreciative chuckle in his voice. "The old man came through after all, and he even saved us the trouble of an awkward conversation. He must have left it for us and then gone out for his morning walk." They would walk over to the box, their steps light and eager. They were not suspicious. They were not cautious. Their minds were so completely consumed by their own narrative, so certain of my weakness and their own power, that they could not conceive of any other possibility. The box to them was not a mystery. It was a delivery. It was the $500,000 they had ordered packaged for their convenience. The final act of my surrender. As my plane began its final descent into the organized chaos of LaGuardia Airport, the gray morning light of New York City filling my window, I knew another scene was beginning on my quiet street in Charlotte. A scene I had directed from afar, a final act of a play that had been a week in the making. It was the scene of the victor's return. I could picture them with a historian's clarity, their movements and motives as predictable as the tides. They would have arrived at precisely noon, the deadline they had so imperiously set. I saw them emerge from a gleaming black SUV, two figures of dazzling, triumphant success. Trevor, my son-in-law, in a sharply tailored suit, a picture of a man who had faced a crisis and emerged victorious. And Naomi, my daughter, in a bright, stylish dress, looking like a woman on her way to a garden party, not a woman whose life had been on the brink of ruin just a dozen hours earlier. They were a perfect portrait of wealth and privilege, a golden couple arriving not to beg, but to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs. I pictured them walking up my familiar stone path with a proprietary air, Trevor carrying an expensive leather briefcase, not to put money in, but to carry it out. They were not expecting a difficult transaction. They were expecting a simple delivery. I imagined Trevor in a final act of casual ownership, not even bothering to knock, simply reaching out to try the doorknob, expecting it to be open, expecting me to be waiting for them in the foyer like an obedient and slightly pathetic servant. The knob wouldn't have turned. The deadbolt I had thrown for the last time would have held firm. The door would be locked. This would be the first small, unexpected note in their symphony of triumph. A minor inconvenience, a disruption to their smooth victory. A flicker of annoyance would have crossed Trevor's face. "What the hell?" I could hear him muttering, rattling the knob again, a sharp, angry sound in the quiet of the morning. "Did he lock it? Where is he? He knew we were coming at noon." Naomi, I imagined, would sigh, a sound of pure, put-upon exasperation. She would pull out her phone. "Honestly," she would say, her voice dripping with the condescension of a woman whose time is far too valuable for such minor inconveniences. "He's probably in the backyard, or maybe he went for a walk. The old man is probably so pleased with himself for saving the day that he's completely forgotten the schedule. Just call him again." They could not imagine that the locked door was a deliberate act. In their worldview, I was a passive element, a bank account. A bank account does not lock itself. They would have seen it as a sign of my forgetfulness, my senility, a further confirmation of the narrative they had constructed about me. As Trevor began to dial my number, the number of a phone that was at that very moment flying at 30,000 feet over the state of New Jersey, Naomi's eyes would have scanned the porch, and then she would have seen it. Tucked away near the old rocking chair where Rose used to sit, a place of honor now occupied by a simple, plain, and utterly unexpected object, a cardboard box. "Oh, wait," she would say, her voice brightening, the annoyance vanishing, replaced by a wave of relief and then a surge of greedy excitement. "Trevor, look." He would stop dialing and follow her gaze. A slow, triumphant smile would spread across his face. It was the smile of a chess player who sees his opponent's king fall into the exact trap he had set. "Well, what do you know?" he would say, a low, appreciative chuckle in his voice. "The old man actually did it, and he even saved us the trouble of an awkward conversation. He must have left it for us and then gone out for his walk, just like I said." They would laugh then, a shared, ugly laugh of pure, condescending relief. It was the laugh of two people who had just been confirmed in their own genius. They would walk over to the box, their steps light and eager. They were not suspicious. They were not cautious. Their minds were so completely consumed by their own narrative, so certain of my weakness and their own power that they could not conceive of any other possibility. The box to them was not a mystery. It was a delivery. It was the $500,000 they had ordered, packaged for their convenience, the final tangible proof of my surrender. I imagined Trevor picking up the box, testing its weight. "Feels about right for $500,000 in paperwork," he would joke, his confidence fully restored. "Let's get this in the car. I want that cashier's check in my bank's hands before 1 o'clock. Then, my dear, we have a champagne lunch to attend." "I can't believe how easy that was," Naomi would say, running her hand over the dusty cardboard as if it were a chest of gold. "He was so broken last night. All it took was a few tears and a little bit of pressure. He's so predictable." They would look at the box and they would see their future, the down payment on the bigger house on Lake Norman, the first-class tickets to Italy, the new wardrobe, the life of effortless luxury they so deeply believed they deserved. I, on my end, looked at the box in my mind's eye and I saw a history lesson, a final, unavoidable exam on the nature of consequences, an exam they were about to fail in the most spectacular way imaginable. Their greed was a powerful lens that distorted the entire world to fit their desires. They could not see a simple cardboard box. They could only see a treasure chest they believed was rightfully theirs. They would turn and begin to walk back down the path carrying the instrument of their own destruction. They would be laughing, their shoulders brushing against each other. They were a happy couple, a successful couple, a couple with a bright, limitless future, all neatly contained in a plain brown box. They would reach the Uber and Trevor would open the back door, ready to place the box carefully on the leather seat, a sacred object to be transported with care. But Naomi, impatient, giddy with the thrill of victory, would stop him. "Wait," she would say, her voice a playful, excited whisper. "Let's just look. I want to see it. I want to hold that check in my hand. Just a peek. Please." Trevor would hesitate for a moment, the practical, cautious side of him at war with the triumphant, indulgent one. But he would look at her shining, happy face, the face of the woman for whom he had orchestrated this entire affair, and he would smile. "All right," he would say. "A quick peek. Then we go. We have a future to start." He would place the box on the hood of the black SUV. The sun would glint off the polished paint. It was a perfect, beautiful day. The stage was set. The audience was waiting. And the actors, convinced they were the heroes of the story, were about to deliver the final devastating line. Naomi would reach out her fingers, finding the edge of the packing tape, and she would begin to pull. As they stood there on the precipice, the cardboard box on the hood of the car, I knew what they would be saying. I had given them the victory they craved, and now they would celebrate it with the one thing they had in abundance: contempt. I was thousands of feet in the air, a silent observer in a dark metal tube, but in my mind's eye I was standing right there on the sidewalk, a ghost at their victory parade, listening to the final arrogant verses of their victory song. All right," I could hear Trevor saying, a low, amused chuckle in his voice as he gave in to Naomi's demand to see the check. "You're like a kid on Christmas morning. Let's see the old man's official surrender document." He would place the box on the hood of the car, a makeshift altar for their final act of worship at the shrine of their own cleverness. Naomi, I imagined, would be practically vibrating with excitement, her fingers tracing the plain brown cardboard as if it were spun gold. "I just can't get over how easy it was," she would say, her voice a giddy whisper of disbelief. "All that drama last night, the pacing, the hand-wringing, the whole 'this is my life-saving' speech. It was all just a show, a final pathetic bit of theater. He was always going to fold." "Of course he was," Trevor would say, his voice full of the easy, condescending wisdom of a man who believes he has the world figured out. "It's a generational thing. His whole generation, they're programmed to sacrifice for their kids. They see it as their ultimate duty. They build their little nests, and then they're biologically obligated to hand them over. We didn't even have to push that hard. We just facilitated his duty." They would laugh, then a shared ugly laugh of pure condescending relief. It was the laugh of two people who had just been confirmed in their own genius. "It's Mom, you know." Chloe would continue, her tone now that of a skilled psychologist analyzing a simple-minded patient. "He's been so lost since she died. He's lonely and sentimental. All I had to do was cry a little bit, mention her name, talk about her legacy, and he just crumbled. He's so predictable. It's almost sad." The historian in me, the quiet observer in my own mind, noted the irony. They called me predictable, and in a way I was. I was predictably a father who loved his daughter. That was the part of me they saw, the part they knew how to exploit. They could not see the other part, the historian, who was just as predictably a man who believed that all actions, especially those of the arrogant and the cruel, have clear and unavoidable consequences. They were reading this first page of the book and assuming they knew the ending. All those books. Trevor would sneer, gesturing vaguely towards my house. All that history he's so proud of, what good did it do him? He's just a soft old professor. He doesn't understand how the real world works. The world of leverage, of opportunity, of taking what you want. He thinks the world is a library. He doesn't realize it's a marketplace. And we, my dear, just executed the deal of a lifetime. To the deal of a lifetime, Naomi would echo, her eyes shining. To the Lake Norman house. And to finally getting rid of this dusty old place. Can you imagine, a year from now this will all just be a pile of rubble and our new house will be almost finished? A year from now, Trevor would say, his voice full of a grand expansive vision. We'll be sitting on the deck of our new house, drinking champagne, watching the boats go by. And this whole messy, stressful affair will just be a funny story we tell at parties. The story of how we convinced your sentimental old dad to finally fund our future. The future. It was so real to them, so tangible, they could already taste the champagne. They were so busy celebrating their victory, so engrossed in counting the spoils of a war they thought they had already won, that they never once stopped to question the ease of it all. A historian knows that the most devastating defeats are always preceded by the most arrogant moments of triumph, and their moment of triumph was glorious and beautifully, wonderfully short. Okay, enough talk, Naomi would say, her impatience finally winning out. Let's see it. Let's see the check that officially makes us the new masters of the universe. Trevor would grin and turn his attention back to the box. He would take a small, elegant pocket knife from his suit jacket and with a flick of his wrist slit the packing tape with a clean, surgical precision. The sound would be sharp, final. They would stand there for a moment, two conquerors on the verge of claiming their prize, their faces bathed in the golden light of their own self-satisfaction. They would look at each other, a shared, triumphant smile passing between them. The world was theirs. The future was theirs. Everything they had ever wanted was contained within this simple, unassuming cardboard box. They were laughing as they began to open the flaps. They thought they were opening the first page of their new, wonderful life. They had no idea they were actually opening the cover of a history book. A book that would tell the sad, short, and brutal story of their own fall from a great and foolish height. The sound of the packing tape ripping was a sharp, satisfying tear in the fabric of the quiet suburban morning. It was the sound of a seal being broken, of a final judgment being opened to the world. In my mind's eye, I was standing right there on the sidewalk, an invisible witness to the precise moment their world, a world built on a foundation of lies and arrogance, began to unravel. They folded back the cardboard flaps with the eager, hungry hands of conquerors claiming their prize. They peered inside their faces, alight with the giddy, triumphant certainty of their victory. And then the first faint, discordant note in their symphony of success. A flicker of confusion. The box was not filled with neat banded stacks of $100 bills, as Naomi had perhaps dreamed. Nor was there a crisp official cashier's check from the bank nestled in a protective envelope, as Trevor had so confidently predicted. There was no money at all. The box was full of paper. A single thick, daunting stack of plain black and white printer paper, almost as if I had emptied my office printer's paper tray into a box. And on top of it, a single folded letter in a cream-colored envelope, and a flimsy, almost comically out-of-place bus ticket. What is this?" I could hear Naomi saying, her voice a reedy whisper of disappointment and confusion. "It's just paper." Trevor, ever the optimist, ever the man in control, would have scoffed, his confidence unshaken. "Don't be ridiculous," he would say, his voice full of a forced, hearty reassurance. "The check must be at the bottom. The old man probably wrapped it up in all this paper to protect it, to hide it. He's so dramatic, so old-fashioned. Give me that." I could see his hands, his expensive manicured hands, reaching impatiently into the box. He would lift the heavy stack of paper, his eyes searching underneath it for the prize, for the check, for the key to his new life. He would find nothing. He would let the stack of paper drop back into the box with a soft, unsatisfying thud. He would rummage through the pages, his movements becoming more frantic, more agitated. He would be looking for the one thing that mattered to him, the one thing he had been promised, the one thing he had so successfully extorted. He was looking for the money. "It's not here," he would say, his voice no longer confident but a low, angry growl of frustration. "The check's not here. What the hell is this? What is he playing at? Is this his idea of a sick joke?" The easy victory was not materializing. The simple transaction had become complicated. The first cold tendrils of a new, unfamiliar feeling dread would begin to creep into the edges of their triumphant celebration. "The letter," Naomi would whisper, her eyes fixed on the cream-colored envelope as if it were a venomous snake. "What does the letter say?" Trevor would snatch it from the top of the papers. He would tear it open with a rough, angry motion, his finesse gone replaced by a brute frustration. He would unfold the single sheet of my personal stationery, and he would begin to read. And as he read, I, in my seat, 30,000 feet above the earth, would be reading along with him every word, a carefully sharpened knife I had prepared for this very moment. "My dearest Naomi," the letter began. "What?" Trevor would snarl. "He wrote it to you." He would shove the letter into her hands. "Here, you read it. This is your family's crazy drama." Naomi would take the letter, her hands trembling now, and she would begin to read aloud, her voice a thin, reedy whisper in the quiet street. "If you are reading this, it means my plan is already in motion. The briefcase of evidence you see here is an exact duplicate of one that is by now in the hands of the federal authorities." She would stop. The words would hang in the air, heavy and poisonous. Federal authorities' evidence. The confusion on their faces would begin to curdle, to transform into the first pale shades of stark cold fear. "What is he talking about?" Trevor would hiss. "What evidence? Keep reading." Naomi's eyes would scan down the page, her breath catching in her throat. "I did not do this to hurt you. I did this because I had no other choice. I did this because the father in me had to finally step aside and let the man your mother married do what was necessary. I discovered what you and Trevor were doing. I saw the names of our oldest friends on a list of victims." At the word victims, I could picture the blood draining from Trevor's face. The confident smirk of the con man would be replaced by the slack-jawed horror of the convicted. He would know in that instant that the game was over. Naomi's voice would be a choked, broken thing as she continued. "This is not a punishment, Naomi. It is a reckoning. The bus ticket is a symbolic choice. It is a path to a simple, honest life. I do not expect you to take it, but I had to offer it. The father in me had to offer it." Trevor would snatch the flimsy bus ticket from the box, staring at it as if it were an alien object. "A bus ticket," he would whisper, his voice full of a horrified disbelief. "A bus ticket to West Virginia." Naomi would be reaching the end of the letter. "This is the last letter I will ever write to you. The man who is left can only offer you the truth, and the truth is now in your hands. Do with it what you will. Goodbye, Dad." The letter was the indictment. It was the cold, clear, and final declaration that their world had changed. But the evidence, the full crushing weight of their crimes, was still waiting for them in the box. Trevor, his mind now a screaming vortex of panic, would lunge for the stack of paper. He would rip it from the box, the pages scattering in the gentle breeze, a blizzard of black and white damnation. And he would see it all. He, the architect of the crime, would instantly recognize his own handiwork, now presented to him as a case file for his own prosecution. The scanned pages of his own handwritten ledger. The forged account statements, each one a separate count of wire fraud. And the master spreadsheet, the predator's playbook, with its cold clinical notes about the vulnerabilities of his victims. He would understand with a speed and clarity that would shatter his soul that I knew everything. The swagger, the confidence, the entire carefully constructed persona of the financial genius would evaporate in that instant, leaving behind only the raw animal panic of a cornered and very stupid thief. Naomi, her face as white as the papers fluttering to the ground, would see it too. She would see the names of people she had known her entire life listed as assets in her husband's criminal enterprise. The fantasy she had been living, the beautiful, convenient lie she had told herself that this was a victimless game, would be ripped away, exposing the ugly, parasitic reality beneath. She was not the wife of a brilliant investor. She was the wife of a man who stole from the elderly and the grieving, and she was his partner. They would look at each other, the two of them, the golden couple, standing on a sunny, peaceful street surrounded by the irrefutable black and white proof of their own monstrosity. The Lake Norman house, the trip to Italy, the life of effortless luxury, it all vanished in that instant, replaced by the cold, hard reality of subpoenas, indictments, and prison cells. The box was not a delivery of their future. It was a coffin for it. And they had just with their own eager hands opened the lid. As my plane began its final descent into the organized chaos of LaGuardia Airport, the gray morning light of New York City filling my window, I knew another scene was beginning on my quiet street in Charlotte. A scene I had directed from afar, a final act of a play that had been a week in the making. It was the scene of the victor's return. I could picture them with a historian's clarity, their movements and motives as predictable as the tides. They would be standing by the black SUV, a portrait of smug, self-satisfied greed, the cardboard box sitting on the hood of the car like a makeshift altar for their final act of worship at the shrine of their own cleverness. "Wait!" I could hear my daughter saying, her voice a giddy, impatient whisper. "Let's just look. I want to see it. I want to hold that check in my hand." Trevor, indulgent and triumphant, would agree. I pictured Naomi's hands, her nails perfectly painted, reaching for the heavy packing tape. The sound of the tape ripping would be a sharp, violent tear in the quiet of the suburban morning. It would be the sound of a seal being broken, of a final judgment being opened to the world. They would fold back the cardboard flaps, their faces alight with greedy anticipation, and then the first faint, discordant note in their symphony of success. A flicker of confusion. Before I reveal what was really inside that box, type "still here" in the comments so I know you're standing with me. And one small note, some details in the next part are adapted for narrative and educational purposes. If you prefer not to continue, feel free to pause here. The box was not filled with neat banded stacks of $100 bills as Naomi had perhaps dreamed. Nor was there a crisp official cashier's check from the bank nestled in a protective envelope as Trevor had so confidently predicted. There was no money at all. The box was full of paper. A single thick, daunting stack of plain black and white printer paper, almost as if I had emptied my office printer's paper tray into a box. And on top of it, a single folded letter in a cream-colored envelope and a flimsy, almost comically out-of-place bus ticket. "What? What is this?" I could hear Naomi saying, her voice a reedy whisper of disappointment and confusion. "It's just paper." Trevor, ever the optimist, ever the man in control, would have scoffed, his confidence unshaken. "Don't be ridiculous," he would say, his voice full of a forced, hearty reassurance. "The check must be at the bottom. The old man probably wrapped it up in all this paper to protect it, to hide it. He's so dramatic, so old-fashioned. Give me that." I could see his hands, his expensive manicured hands, reaching impatiently into the box. He would lift the heavy stack of paper, his eyes searching underneath it for the prize, for the check, for the key to his new life. He would find nothing. He would let the stack of paper drop back into the box with a soft, unsatisfying thud. He would rummage through the pages, his movements becoming more frantic, more agitated. He was looking for the one thing that mattered to him, the one thing he had been promised, the one thing he had so successfully extorted. He was looking for the money. "It's not here," he would say, his voice no longer confident, but a low, angry growl of frustration. "The check's not here. What the hell is this? What is he playing at? Is this his idea of a sick joke?" The easy victory was not materializing. The simple transaction had become complicated. The first cold tendrils of a new, unfamiliar feeling, dread, would begin to creep into the edges of their triumphant celebration. The letter, Naomi would whisper, her eyes fixed on the cream-colored envelope as if it were a venomous snake. "What does the letter say?" Trevor would snatch it from the top of the papers. He would tear it open with a rough, angry motion, his finesse gone, replaced by a brute frustration. He would unfold the single sheet of my personal stationery and he would begin to read. And as he read, I, in my seat 30,000 feet above the earth, would be reading along with him, every word a carefully sharpened knife I had prepared for this very moment. "My dearest Naomi," the letter began. "What?" Trevor would snarl. "He wrote it to you." He would shove the letter into her hands. "Here, you read it. This is your family's crazy drama." Naomi would take the letter, her hands trembling now, and she would begin to read aloud, her voice a thin, reedy whisper in the quiet street. If you are reading this, it means my plan is already in motion. The briefcase of evidence you see here is an exact duplicate of one that is by now in the hands of the federal authorities. She would stop. The words would hang in the air, heavy and poisonous. Federal authorities, evidence. The confusion on their faces would begin to curdle to transform into the first pale shades of stark, cold fear. What is he talking about? Trevor would hiss. What evidence? Keep reading. Naomi's eyes would scan down the page, her breath catching in her throat. I did not do this to hurt you. I did this because I had no other choice. I did this because the father in me had to finally step aside and let the man your mother married do what was necessary. I discovered what you and Trevor were doing. I saw the names of our oldest friends on a list of victims. At the word victims, I could picture the blood draining from Trevor's face. The confident smirk of the con man would be replaced by the slack-jawed horror of the convicted. He would know in that instant that the game was over. Naomi's voice would be a choked, broken thing as she continued. This is not a punishment, Naomi. It is a reckoning. The bus ticket is a symbolic choice. It is a path to a simple, honest life. I do not expect you to take it, but I had to offer it. The father in me had to offer it. Trevor would snatch the flimsy bus ticket from the box, staring at it as if it were an alien object. A bus ticket, he would whisper, his voice full of a horrified disbelief. A bus ticket to West Virginia. Naomi would be reaching the end of the letter. This is the last letter I will ever write to you. The man who is left can only offer you the truth, and the truth is now in your hands. Do with it what you will. Goodbye, Dad. The letter was the indictment. It was the cold, clear, and final declaration that their world had changed. But the evidence, the full crushing weight of their crimes, was still waiting for them in the box. Trevor, his mind now a screaming vortex of panic, would lunge for the stack of paper. He would rip it from the box, the pages scattering in the gentle breeze, a blizzard of black and white damnation. And he would see it all. He, the architect of the crime, would instantly recognize his own handiwork now presented to him as a case file for his own prosecution. The scanned pages of his own handwritten ledger, the forged account statements, each one a separate count of wire fraud, and the master spreadsheet, the predator's playbook with its cold, clinical notes about the vulnerabilities of his victims. He would understand with a speed and clarity that would shatter his soul that I knew everything. The swagger, the confidence, the entire carefully constructed persona of the financial genius would evaporate in that instant, leaving behind only the raw animal panic of a cornered and very stupid thief. Naomi, her face as white as the papers fluttering to the ground, would see it too. She would see the names of people she had known her entire life listed as assets in her husband's criminal enterprise. The fantasy she had been living, the beautiful, convenient lie she had told herself that this was a victimless game, that they were just playing the market, would be ripped away, exposing the ugly, parasitic reality beneath. She was not the wife of a brilliant investor. She was the wife of a man who stole from the elderly and the grieving, and she was his partner. They would look at each other, the two of them, the golden couple, standing on a sunny, peaceful street surrounded by the irrefutable black and white proof of their own monstrosity. The Lake Norman house, the trip to Italy, the life of effortless luxury, it all vanished in that instant, replaced by the cold, hard reality of subpoenas, indictments, and prison cells. The box was not a delivery of their future. It was a coffin for it, and they had just with their own eager hands opened the lid. The scream that followed was not one of anger or frustration. It was a shared guttural sound of pure, soul-shattering terror. The scream of two people watching their entire world burn to the ground in front of their eyes. The scream of two arrogant, untouchable gods who had just been cast out of their paper heaven and into a very real, very unforgiving hell. The scream of two people who had just realized with absolute and final certainty that their lives were over. The perfect suburban street would no longer be quiet. The reckoning had begun. I was not there to hear it, of course. I was thousands of feet in the air, a silent observer suspended between the dark earth and the indifferent stars. But I have heard that scream in the quiet of my own mind 1,000 times since. It is a sound that will echo in the halls of my memory for the rest of my days. It would not have started as a scream. It would have started as a silence, a profound, absolute, and terrifying silence. The moment after the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The moment they looked from the forged document that proved their crime to the sales contract that proved their failure to the single insulting bus ticket that prescribed their future. It would be a moment of pure cognitive dissonance, a moment where the triumphant, beautiful reality in their minds collided with the ugly, catastrophic reality scattered on the hood of the car. The brain in such moments simply stops. In that silence, I see my daughter Naomi, her face a mask of chalky white, her eyes wide with a horror that was not just about the loss of money, but about the loss of self. She would be looking at the evidence, but she would be seeing for the first time the true, unedited ugliness of her own choices. She would see the names of our friends not as abstract sources of capital, but as real people she had known her whole life, people she had helped to defraud. She would see her mother's legacy not as a tool to be cynically invoked, but as a sacred trust she had betrayed. And she would see her father not as a weak, sentimental old fool to be managed, but as a quiet, patient historian who had simply allowed her to write her own tragic final chapter. Trevor, the slick con man, the man who was always 10 steps ahead, would be equally frozen. But his horror would be different. It would be the cold, professional horror of a master chess player who has just realized he has not been playing against a novice, but against a grandmaster who sacrificed his queen 10 moves ago to set up an inescapable checkmate. He would see the elegant, brutal architecture of my plan, the discovery, the feigned surrender, the gathering of evidence, the secret sale of the house, the final public trap. He would see that his own arrogance, his own greed, his own contempt for me had been the very weapons I had used against him. He had not been the predator. He had been the prey, and he had walked into the snare with a happy, confident smile on his face. The first sound would have come from Naomi. Not a scream, but a small, choked animal sound, a whimper from the back of her throat. The sound of a mind breaking under an unbearable weight of truth. And then the scream. I know what they will say. They will say it was a scream of anger of a spoiled woman throwing a tantrum because her rich father had cut her off. They do not understand. I do. It was not a scream of anger. Anger is a hot, powerful emotion, the emotion of someone who believes they still have a fight left in them. No. This was a different sound. It was a cold sound. The sound of a final, fatal impact. The sound a soul makes when it hits rock bottom at a terminal velocity. It was the scream of absolute and total annihilation. It was the scream of a future vanishing in an instant. The house on Lake Norman, the trip to Italy, the life of effortless, admired luxury, all of it gone, replaced by the stark, terrifying reality of lawyers' offices and prison cells. It was the scream of public humiliation, the realization that their story, the carefully curated performance of their success, was over. And a new, uglier story was about to begin, a story told in headlines and gossip columns, a story where they were the villains, the fools, the pathetic, grasping children who had tried to destroy their own father and had only succeeded in destroying themselves. But more than anything, it was the scream of the truth, a truth they had spent their entire lives avoiding. A truth they had buried under a mountain of expensive clothes and fancy cars and beautiful lies. The truth that they were not special. The truth that their actions had consequences. The truth that they were in the end nothing more than cheap common thieves. It was the scream of two people being forced for the first time in their pampered, privileged lives to look at themselves in a clear, unforgiving mirror. And the reflection was a monster. The scream would have echoed down my quiet, respectable street, a sound of such raw despair that neighbors would have come to their windows. The Uber driver who had been waiting patiently would have stared in horror. The perfect suburban facade, the illusion of peace and prosperity, would have been shattered by that single human and utterly broken sound. The trap was sprung. The judgment was delivered. And the only thing left was the long echoing silence that always follows a scream. A silence filled with the quiet, methodical, and inescapable turning of the wheels of justice. Their world, once a boundless horizon of endless opportunity, had shrunk in a single terrifying instant to the dimensions of a cardboard box. The silence that followed their shared scream was the silence of absolute ruin. For a moment, they were just two children lost in a dark and terrible wood, the path behind them gone, the path ahead shrouded in an impenetrable fog. But the paralysis of that initial shock could not last. It was replaced by the frantic, desperate energy of a cornered animal. Panic, raw, unthinking, and all-consuming. "Call him," Trevor hissed, his voice a ragged, broken thing. He was grabbing at the scattered papers on the hood of the car, stuffing them back into the box as if hiding the evidence could somehow reverse the reality of its existence. "Call your father. Now find out where he is." Naomi, her hands trembling so violently she could barely hold her phone, fumbled to unlock the screen. Her perfectly manicured thumb smeared across the glass as she stabbed at my contact picture. She put the phone to her ear, her entire body rigid with a desperate, praying tension. I imagine her listening to the empty, soulless sound of the phone ringing unanswered in a distant airport terminal or a quiet, anonymous hotel room. "He's not answering," she cried, a fresh wave of hysteria rising in her voice. "It's just ringing. He's not picking up." "Then call him again," Trevor snarled, his face pale and slick with a cold sweat. "Keep calling. He has to answer. We have to reason with him. Explain. This is a misunderstanding. A terrible, terrible misunderstanding." He was already trying to construct a new lie, a new narrative to escape the inescapable truth. But the words sounded hollow even to him. Naomi called again, and again, and again. Each unanswered ring was another nail being hammered into the coffin of their hope. With each failed attempt, their panic escalated. The quiet, manicured street was no longer a symbol of their success. It was a stage for their humiliation, a silent, watching witness to their downfall. My neighbor, I imagined, might be peering through his blinds, wondering about the commotion, the screaming, the two beautiful, well-dressed people who were now frantically pacing on the sidewalk like caged animals. "The flight," Trevor said suddenly, his eyes wide with a new horror. "The letter said he was on a flight to New York." He turned his phone off. "Oh my God, he's actually doing it. He's not bluffing." The realization that this was not a threat but a meticulously executed plan seemed to drain the last of the strength from Naomi's legs. She slid down the side of the sleek black SUV, her beautiful dress crumpling on the pavement, and buried her face in her hands. "What are we going to do?" she sobbed. "Trevor, what are we going to do? Our lives, they're over. Everything is over." Trevor's mind, a machine built for finding angles and escape routes, was racing, searching for any move in a game that was already lost. And then a final desperate idea. "Charlie," he said, his voice a low, urgent whisper. "Call Charlie Evans, your father's lawyer, his best friend." Naomi looked up, a flicker of something not quite hope, but a desperate last-gasp strategy in her eyes. "Charlie, why?" "He's an old man just like your father," Trevor said, his voice rapid, piecing together the new plan. "They're from the same generation. Sentimental. He's been their family lawyer for 50 years. He won't want to see this family destroyed. We can reason with him. We'll tell him your father has had some kind of breakdown, that he's not thinking clearly. We can appeal to his sense of loyalty, of friendship. He can stop this. He can call the bank, call the authorities, tell them it was all a mistake. He has to help us." It was a desperate, foolish plan born of a complete misunderstanding of the kind of man Charlie Evans was, but it was the only plan they had left. Naomi, clinging to this last flimsy thread of hope, scrolled through her phone again. She found Charlie's number, a number she had probably never called in her life, and pressed the button. I can picture Charlie sitting in his own quiet study, a glass of fine bourbon on his desk, waiting for this very call. He would have let it ring twice, a small professional courtesy, before answering. "Charlie Evans," he would say, his voice a calm, deep baritone. "Charlie, it's Naomi Vance." She would cry into the phone, her voice a mess of tears and panic. "Oh, thank God you answered. Something terrible has happened. It's my father, I think. I think he's had some kind of nervous breakdown." She would then launch into a frantic, edited version of the story. She would tell him about the box, about the crazy letter, about the insane idea that she and Trevor had done anything wrong. She would paint me as a senile, grieving old man who had lost his mind and was now trying to destroy his own family out of a misguided sense of grief. Charlie, on his end, would listen patiently, not saying a word, letting her spin her web of lies. He would let her exhaust herself, her frantic monologue eventually slowing down as she ran out of breath and invention. When she was finally finished, there would be a long, heavy silence on the line. "Are you finished, Naomi?" He would ask, his voice utterly devoid of sympathy. The coldness in his tone would be the first sign that this was not going to go the way she had planned. Yes, she would stammer. Charlie, you have to help us. You have to stop him. You're his best friend. You're the only one who can talk sense into him. Naomi, Charlie would say, and his voice would be the voice of a judge delivering a final verdict. I have just two things to say to you. First, I am not your father's lawyer in this matter. In fact, I am representing a number of the investors whose money your husband has stolen. Therefore, I am not your friend. I am your adversary. The shock of this statement would be a physical blow, but he wouldn't be finished. And second, he would continue, his voice dropping even lower, becoming as cold and hard as a prison door shutting. My only official advice to you and to Mr. Hayes is to find yourself the best criminal defense attorney you can possibly afford, and I would suggest you do it quickly. From this moment on, any and all future communications should be directed to me through your legal counsel. Do you understand? He would not wait for an answer. He would simply hang up. The quiet final click of the disconnected line would be the sound of the last door in the world slamming shut in her face. She would slowly lower the phone from her ear, her face a mask of disbelief and dawning absolute horror. There was no help coming. There was no misunderstanding. Charlie was not an ally. He was the enemy. Her father was not a grieving old man. He was a brilliant, ruthless strategist. And they were not the victims of a misunderstanding. They were the targets of a perfectly executed, legally sound, and morally justified demolition. The panic was no longer about a lost fortune. It was about a lost future. It was the panic of two people who had just realized with absolute and final certainty that they were utterly, completely, and irrevocably alone. The scream was the sound of the world ending, their world, a world built on a fragile foundation of lies and other people's money. But after the scream, after the raw animal terror, comes the frantic, desperate scramble for survival. And in that scramble, they would only succeed in pulling the rest of their rotten structure down on top of themselves. I was not there to see it, of course. I was in a quiet, anonymous hotel room in New York, the leather briefcase with its damning evidence sitting on the table beside me. But I knew their characters. I knew the mechanics of the crime. And I knew with the cold certainty of a forensic accountant exactly what would happen next. The scream was just the first sound of the collapse. The next sound, happening miles away in a different part of the city, was much quieter but far more destructive. It was the sound of a telephone ringing. I could picture the scene in a sleek, top-floor office in one of Charlotte's financial towers. A man whose name I had seen in Trevor's ledger with a question mark next to it, a man I will call Mr. Petrov. He was not one of our old, trusting family friends. He was one of Trevor's newer, more sophisticated investors. A ruthless man who had likely made his own fortune in the gray areas of the law. He was the investor who was getting suspicious. He was the reason for the $500,000 demand. He was the first critical domino. I saw him looking at the expensive watch on his wrist. It would be 12:05 p.m. The deadline Trevor had been given had passed. Mr. Petrov, I knew from the notes in the ledger, was not a patient man. He would pick up his phone and dial Trevor's number. And on that quiet, sunny sidewalk in front of my house, amidst the scattered, damning pages of their own indictment, Trevor's phone would begin to ring. He would see the name Mr. Petrov on the screen, and a new, colder, more specific kind of terror would seize him. This was no longer about his father-in-law. This was about the very real, very dangerous man whose money he had already spent. Naomi would look at him, her face a mess of tears and fury. "Answer it," she would hiss. He would answer, his hand trembling, his voice a pathetic, reedy imitation of its usual confident tone. "Mr. Petrov," he would stammer. I was just about to call you. There's been a slight delay." From his office, Mr. Petrov would not be shouting. His voice would be as cold and as quiet as a tomb. "A delay, Mr. Hayes," he would say. "I was not aware that our agreement had a provision for delays. The funds were to be in my account by noon. It is now 5 minutes past. You are in breach of our arrangement." I know I can explain," Trevor would plead, his eyes darting around wildly, looking for a new lie, a new escape route. My father-in-law. There was a family emergency." "I am not interested in your family emergencies, Mr. Hayes." Petrov would cut him off. "I am interested only in my money. You have 1 hour. If the $500,000 is not in my account in 1 hour, I will be forced to conclude that you are not just incompetent, but a fraud. And I will begin making the necessary phone calls to protect my other financial interests from your contagion. And he would hang up. The 1 hour deadline. It would be a death sentence. Trevor and Naomi would stare at each other, their own petty mutual betrayals forgotten in the face of this new, more immediate threat. 1 hour. They had no money. They had no allies. They had nothing. The hour would tick by, each minute an eternity, each second a hammer blow on the coffin of their hopes. They would make more frantic, unanswered calls to me, to Charlie, to anyone they could think of. But all the doors were closed, and in his office, Mr. Petrov would watch the clock. At 1:06 p.m., the money would still not have arrived. And he, a man of his word, would pick up his phone. He would have a list, the same list of names I had seen in the ledger, and he would start at the top. His first call would be to another major investor, a man named Mr. Chen. Chen, Petrov would say, his voice calm and lethal. It's Petrov. We have a problem with our mutual friend, Mr. Hayes. I have reason to believe his fund is insolvent. He has just defaulted on a significant payment to me. I would advise you to pull your capital immediately if you can. The fire would begin to spread. Chen, a man of similar temperament, would not wait for an explanation. He would immediately hang up and call his own broker, and then he would call 2 other investors he knew were in the fund. Get your money out of Hayes's fund now, he would say. It's a sinking ship. A Ponzi scheme is not a fortress. It is a house of cards built on a single fragile foundation trust. All it takes is the removal of a single critical card for the entire structure to collapse. I had not just removed my own money from the equation. I had, by doing so, triggered the very crisis of confidence that every con man dreads more than death itself, the run on the bank. Within minutes, the news would be spreading like a virus through the small, interconnected world of Trevor's wealthy investors. Fear is far more infectious than greed, and the fear of being the last man out is the most powerful force in any market. Trevor's phone, which had been silent for an hour, would suddenly light up like a Christmas tree. Call after call from numbers he recognized. Panicked investors, angry investors, investors who were all at once demanding their money back. I can see him and Naomi standing there on that sidewalk, watching the phone vibrate and buzz the screen, a flashing, strobing catalog of all the people they had betrayed. They would not answer. They could not. There was nothing to say. There was no money. There was no escape. They had spent a year building their fragile empire of lies, and it all came crashing down in less than 60 minutes. Not with a bang, but with the quiet, insistent, and utterly devastating sound of a series of unanswered phone calls, each one another voice in a choir of their own ruin. The scream was the sound of the world ending, their world. But after the scream, after the raw animal terror comes the frantic, desperate scramble for survival. The first casualty in that scramble is always loyalty. The scream was the sound of their shared ruin. The fight that followed was the sound of the survivors turning on each other for the last pathetic scraps in the wreckage. I can see them standing there on the quiet, sunny sidewalk, the Uber having driven away, abandoning them in the middle of their own disaster. The initial shock, the paralysis of their downfall, would have given way to a much uglier, more primal emotion: blame. Naomi would have been the first to speak. Her voice no longer the hysterical shriek of a panicked victim, but a low, venomous hiss, the sound of a snake coiling to strike. "Look at us," she would have said, her words dripping with a contempt so profound it was a physical thing. "Standing on a sidewalk like trash. This was your brilliant plan, Trevor. This was the magnificent life you promised me. You were supposed to be a genius." Trevor, who had been staring blankly at my closed front door, would slowly turn to face her. The fear in his eyes would be replaced by a cold, cruel fury. He would see her not as his wife, not as his partner, but as the living, breathing embodiment of his own catastrophic failure. "My plan was working perfectly," he would snarl, his voice a ragged, broken thing, "until your senile old man decided to play detective. This is on you, Naomi. You were the one who was supposed to have him under control. He's weak, you said. He'll do anything for me. You were so sure. You were so arrogant." "I was arrogant." She would laugh, a high, unhinged sound that held no humor. "I was arrogant. You were the one talking about a $10 million house on Lake Norman. You were the one who was planning to disappear to the Cayman Islands. You were supposed to be smart, Trevor. You were supposed to be 10 steps ahead of everyone. But you were outsmarted by a 75-year-old man. You're not a genius. You're nothing but a cheap, second-rate con artist, and you dragged me down with you. Her words would hit him, and he would recoil as if struck. Then he would lunge forward, his face a mask of rage. I dragged you down. He would spit his voice a vicious whisper. Are you kidding me, Naomi? Who do you think was paying for that dress you're wearing? For the car you were driving? For the $2,000 a month brunch habit you suddenly developed? You were the one with the endless, bottomless appetite. The house wasn't big enough. The car wasn't new enough. The vacations weren't long enough. You loved the money, Naomi. You swam in it. You wallowed in it. Don't you dare stand there and pretend you were just some innocent, supportive wife. I was a supportive wife, she would scream back. The pretense of suburban quiet now completely shattered. I hosted your clients. I charmed their wives. I played the part. I did my job. Your job, he would laugh again, a truly ugly sound. Your job was to be the bait, the respectable, beautiful daughter of a wealthy, respected old man. That was your only value. That was the only reason I married you, for him, for his money, and you couldn't even deliver on that. The confession, the raw, transactional truth of their entire relationship would hang in the air between them. Their love had been a business partnership, a merger based on a shared prospectus of greed. And now, with the company facing a hostile takeover by the federal government, they were each trying to sell off the other's assets in a desperate attempt to cover their own losses. So that's all I was to you, Naomi would whisper, a genuine, heartbreaking pain finally breaking through her rage. A tool, a way to get to my father's money. What did you think this was, Naomi? Trevor would sneer, his cruelty now absolute. A fairy tale. We were a team, a business. And you, my dear, were our most valuable asset. And now, he would say, kicking at the corner of the cardboard box, you're a liability, just like the rest of this. The last of her illusions would shatter. And then, the instinct for self-preservation, the most ruthless and powerful instinct of all, would take over. Her face would harden, the pain disappearing, replaced by a cold, calculating look that I had never seen on her before, but one that I now recognized was there all along. You're right, she would say, her voice suddenly calm, steady. This is a business, and right now it looks like we're facing a hostile takeover. And in a hostile takeover, the first one to cooperate gets the best severance package. Trevor would freeze. He would stare at her, a new kind of fear dawning in his eyes, the fear of betrayal from his own partner. What are you talking about? He would ask, his voice suddenly weak. I'm talking about saving myself, Naomi would say, her eyes as cold and hard as river stones. My father may have abandoned me, but I am still Naomi Vance. I have friends. My family has a name in this city. You're just some grifter from out of state. Who do you think a jury is going to believe, the charming, repentant daughter who was manipulated by a sociopathic husband, or the sociopathic husband who preyed on her and her grieving father? He would see it then. He would see the new plan forming in her eyes. She was going to sacrifice him to save herself. She was going to use the last of her family's reputation to paint herself as a victim to throw him to the wolves. Their partnership was officially and violently dissolved. They were no longer a team. They were enemies, two scorpions in a bottle, ready to sting each other to death. You wouldn't dare, he would whisper, but there was no conviction in his voice. He knew she would. He had taught her how. I did not flee to New York to hide. I went there to bear witness. My small, anonymous hotel room overlooking the endless, chaotic river of a midtown Manhattan street was not a hiding place. It was an observation post, a quiet, solitary command center from which I would watch the inevitable historical consequences of my actions unfold. The first few days were silent. I had delivered the briefcase of evidence to a contact of Charlie's at the Securities and Exchange Commission, a grim-faced man in a gray suit who had listened to my story without a flicker of emotion and had simply said, "We'll take it from here." My part in the official process was done. I was now just an anonymous source, a ghost in the machine. I spent my days walking. I walked through the Grand Canyons of the financial district, watching the thousands of young, ambitious men and women all dressed in the same uniform of success as my son-in-law rushing to and from their towers of glass and steel. I wondered how many of them were like Trevor, just clever architects of imaginary fortunes. I spent my afternoons in the quiet, hallowed halls of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, losing myself in the long, slow, and often brutal sweep of human history. I would stand for hours in front of paintings of fallen kings and vanquished generals, and I would feel a strange, somber kinship. Every story of arrogance and downfall had already been told, had already been painted. I was simply living out a modern domestic version of an ancient, timeless tragedy. My new life was a study in contrasts. My days were filled with the grand, impersonal spectacle of the city. My nights were spent in the profound, absolute silence of my hotel room. For the first time in years, my phone did not ring with frantic calls for money, for help, for a solution to some new manufactured family drama. There was only the quiet hum of the city below and the steady, even rhythm of my own breathing. It was not happiness, but it was peace. A cold, clean, and hard-won peace. And while I was living in this quiet, I knew that in Charlotte a storm of my own making was gathering force. I did not need to be there to feel it. I simply checked the news the same way a historian reads dispatches from a distant battlefield. At first there was nothing. The world was as it had been. But then on the third day, the first tremor. Charlie sent me a link to a small, obscure financial blog that covered the Charlotte investment scene. The headline was cautious: "Rumors swirl as Hayes Capital freezes withdrawals." The article was short, full of speculation. It spoke of a liquidity crisis and quoted anonymous investors who were growing concerned. It was the first crack in the dam. The next day, the story had grown. It was no longer a blog post. It was an article on the business page of the Charlotte Observer's website. Prominent local financier Trevor Hayes under fire as investors demand answers. The article was more detailed. It mentioned the names of some of the angry investors. It mentioned Mr. Petrov. It mentioned Mr. Chen. It spoke of a sudden, inexplicable run on the fund. It included a picture of Trevor and Naomi from a recent charity gala, the two of them smiling, beautiful, a perfect portrait of a success that was now revealed to be a fragile illusion. I watched it all with a kind of detached academic interest. It was a classic pattern, one I had seen 100 times in my professional life. The slow leak of information, the growing panic, the crisis of confidence, and then the inevitable catastrophic collapse. I was not watching a personal tragedy. I was watching a historical event unfold in real time. The social media storm was even more revealing. Charlie sent me links to community Facebook groups, to Twitter threads. The digital town square was on fire. People were angry. People were scared. I saw comments from the children of some of the elderly victims, their posts a heartbreaking mixture of rage and grief. My mother trusted him with her entire life savings. He took my father's retirement, everything he worked for. And under every post there were dozens of pictures of Naomi and Trevor, pictures of their lavish life, the Range Rover, the expensive vacations, the designer clothes. The public who had once been the audience for their performance of success was now a furious digital mob demanding justice. I thought of my daughter, of her obsession with her public image, with the curated perfection of her online life. She was now a prisoner in her own beautiful home. The digital walls of her fantasy world now covered in the ugly graffiti of 1,000 angry accusations. The applause she had so desperately craved had turned into a chorus of condemnation. And through it all, I felt nothing, no satisfaction, no glee, only a profound clinical sadness. I was a doctor watching a disease I had diagnosed run its predictable and fatal course. My intervention had not been an act of anger. It had been an act of medicine, a harsh, brutal, but necessary surgery to excise a cancer before it could spread any further. I thought of my daughter not with anger, but with a historian's pity. A tragic figure, a woman so blinded by the glittering promise of an unearned life that she had willingly become a co-conspirator in the destruction of her own father and her own soul. Her story would now be a footnote in the larger, uglier story of her husband's crimes, a cautionary tale. On the 5th day, I was sitting in my hotel room looking out the window at the rain-streaked streets of Manhattan when my laptop pinged with a new email from Charlie. The subject line contained only one word: Showtime. I opened the email. It was a link to a live news feed from a Charlotte television station. I clicked it. The image that filled my screen was a live shot from a news helicopter hovering over a familiar tree-lined suburban street. My street. And in the center of the shot, a swarm of dark blue vehicles with official lettering on the side. FBI. The wait was over. The private reckoning had now become a public one. The quiet part was done. And now the loud part would begin. The live news feed on my laptop was a window into a world that was both intimately mine and completely alien. The street I was looking at from 1,000 feet in the air was my own. The quiet, respectable houses, the familiar curve of the road, the canopy of old oak trees, it was the landscape of my entire adult life. But the scene unfolding on that street was a violent, shocking intrusion, a scene from a movie, not from my quiet suburban reality. Dark blue vehicles with bold white letters FBI were parked at odd, aggressive angles blocking the road. Men in dark suits and tactical vests moved with a quiet, purposeful energy, their forms small and ominous from the helicopter's vantage point. They were surrounding my daughter's house, the beautiful, cold, and monstrously expensive house that had been the catalyst for this entire tragedy. A news anchor's voice, calm and professional, provided the narration for the silent, distant drama. "We are live over a developing situation in the upscale Cotswold neighborhood of Charlotte," she said, "where federal agents are currently executing a search and arrest warrant at the home of local financier Trevor Hayes." I watched, my face illuminated by the cold blue light of the screen, a solitary spectator in a dark New York hotel room. I felt a strange and profound sense of detachment, as if I were a historian watching old silent newsreel footage of a distant coup. I knew how this story ended. I had written the ending myself. But seeing it unfold even on a grainy live feed was a different thing entirely. The camera zoomed in on the front door of the house. For a long time, nothing happened. The agents stood in a loose professional formation. The quiet on the street was a tense, held breath. The anchor filled the silence with speculation, quoting the anonymous sources that Charlie and I knew were the whispers of the panicked investors. She spoke of a sudden collapse of Hayes Capital, of allegations of a massive Ponzi scheme, and of dozens of elderly victims. The story I had uncovered in secret was now being broadcast to the entire city. And then there was movement. The front door of the house opened. My heart, which I thought had turned to stone, gave a single painful thud in my chest. Trevor came out first. He was not in a suit. He was in a simple t-shirt and jeans, and he looked small. The slick, confident, predatory energy he had exuded was gone, stripped away by the harsh, unflattering reality of his new situation. His hands were cuffed behind his back. He did not look at the cameras. He just stared at the ground, his face a pale, slack mask of utter, absolute defeat. An agent guided him by the elbow towards one of the dark vehicles. The master of the universe, the brilliant financial wizard, was now just another anonymous, defeated criminal. I felt nothing as I watched him go. No pity, no satisfaction, just the quiet, clinical confirmation of a hypothesis. But then the door opened again, and my daughter, my Naomi, was led out, and the historian, the strategist, the cold, detached observer in my mind vanished in an instant, replaced by the raw, screaming agony of a father. She was in a simple gray sweatsuit, her beautiful long hair a tangled mess. Her face, the face I had known since the moment she was born, was hidden from the camera as she kept her head bowed, a posture of pure, unadulterated shame. But I saw her hands, her slender, delicate hands, the hands I had once taught to hold a pencil, to tie a shoe, were now cuffed behind her back. The sight of the cold, hard steel against her skin was a physical blow, a wound so deep it took my breath away. She stumbled slightly on the top step of the porch, and the agent beside her caught her arm to steady her. In that small, almost imperceptible gesture, I saw the full, terrible scope of her fall. She was no longer a queen in her own castle. She was a prisoner, a ward of the state, a woman who could no longer even navigate the steps of her own home without assistance. The anchor's voice continued, a calm, professional drone that seemed to be coming from another galaxy. "We are now seeing the suspect's wife, Naomi Vance Hayes, also being taken into custody. Sources say she is considered a co-conspirator in the alleged scheme." I did not hear the rest. All I could see was the image of my daughter's cuffed hands. I had done this. My plan, my righteousness, my cold, hard justice had led to this single, unbearable image. The father in me, the one I thought I had buried, was weeping. He was screaming. He was asking if any victory, any principle was worth this cost. I looked away from the screen. My eyes fell on the leather briefcase sitting on the other hotel bed. The briefcase full of the truth. The briefcase that had started it all. And then I thought of the other names in that briefcase. The Hendersons, the Abernathys, The dozens of other good, decent, trusting people whose golden years had been stolen, whose security had been shattered to pay for my daughter's clothes and my son-in-law's cars. I thought of their faces, of their stories, of the quiet, desperate fear they must have felt when they realized their money was gone. And then I thought of Rose. I thought of her quiet, unshakable integrity. I thought of her 40 years as a nurse, of her fierce compassion for the vulnerable, of her absolute intolerance for cruelty and deceit. What would she have said if she had been sitting here with me? She would have wept for her daughter. Her heart would have been broken, but she would not have flinched from the truth. She would have known that this terrible, necessary act of justice was the only path forward, that the crime was not just the theft of money, but the betrayal of a sacred trust. And for that, there had to be a reckoning. My resolve, which had wavered for a long, terrible moment, hardened again. The pain was still there, a wound that would never fully heal, but the rightness of my choice was a solid, unshakable foundation beneath it. I looked back at the screen. The live feed had moved on. The cars were pulling away. My quiet suburban street was being returned to its normal, peaceful state. The brief, violent intrusion of federal justice. Now just a memory, a story the neighbors would tell for years. The anchor was now talking about the weather. I reached out and closed the laptop. The screen went black, plunging the room into a deep and profound silence. The public act was done. The wait was over. The wheels of justice, the great, slow, and impartial machine that I had so deliberately set in motion, were now turning. And I, her father, had been the one to push them. And now I had to learn to live with the sound of the grinding for the rest of my days. The news of their arrest was a public spectacle, a brief, dramatic flare in the city's news cycle. But I knew, as a historian knows, that the real story, the real consequences unfold, not in the bright, loud moments of public drama, but in the quiet, desperate rooms where the deals are made and the betrayals are finalized. I did not have to wait long for that story. A few days after the arrests, Charlie called me in my hotel room. The initial adrenaline of the event had worn off, leaving behind a quiet, somber sense of finality. "Well, Julian," he said, his voice a low, grim rumble over the phone. "It's happening, exactly as we predicted. The rats have started to eat each other." I was silent, waiting. "Trevor's lawyer is no fool," Charlie continued. "He saw the mountain of evidence we handed the DA. He knew a trial was unwinnable. There was no defense. So he went for the only move he had left on the board. He offered up a co-conspirator in exchange for a plea deal." "Naomi," I said. It was not a question. It was a statement of historical inevitability. "He's pleading guilty to everything," Charlie said, his voice a mixture of legal analysis and pure human disgust. "Wire fraud, mail fraud, the whole 9 yards, a full confession. In exchange for the prosecution recommending a reduced sentence, he has agreed to be their star witness against his own wife." I closed my eyes. The father in me felt a distant, aching pang. But the historian simply nodded, acknowledging a pattern as old as time itself. "He's painting a masterpiece of self-pity," Charlie went on, his voice dripping with cynicism. "He's claiming he was a weak, love-struck man who was pushed into the scheme by a greedy, materialistic, and ruthlessly ambitious wife. He's telling the prosecutors that Naomi was the one who was obsessed with the lifestyle, the one who demanded the bigger house, the fancier car, the European vacations. He's claiming she was the one who came up with the final desperate plan to extort the $500,000 from you, saying, and I quote from the proffer, 'He's my father, he's weak, he'll do anything I say.' He's trying to frame himself as a reluctant accomplice, and her as the criminal mastermind. So he's sacrificing her to save himself a few years in a federal prison." I said, the words tasting like poison. "He's trying to," Charlie corrected. "But he's a fool. He's so focused on his own survival that he can't see the bigger picture. He doesn't understand that his testimony, while it buries Naomi, also buries himself. He is gleefully and under oath confessing to every single element of the crime." I listened to Charlie's words and I felt no anger. Only a deep, cold, and final sense of confirmation. Their love, their partnership had been a business arrangement from the very beginning. And now, facing total, catastrophic bankruptcy, Trevor was simply liquidating his last remaining asset, his wife. He was selling her story, her culpability, her future for a discount on his own. "And what about Naomi?" I asked, my voice quiet. "Oh, her lawyers aren't stupid either," Charlie said with a dry chuckle. The moment they found out Trevor had flipped, they launched their own counteroffensive. She is now the ultimate victim, the naive, trusting wife who was kept in the dark by a controlling, sociopathic con man. She's claiming she had no idea where the money was coming from, that he handled all the finances, and that she was a prisoner in a gilded cage. She's even trying to use your letter, the bus ticket, as proof that you knew she was a victim and were trying to give her an escape route. They were no longer a couple. They were two opposing legal arguments, two competing fictions, each designed to completely annihilate the other. They think they're creating reasonable doubt, Charlie said, the lawyer in him marveling at the sheer self-destructive stupidity of it all. But what they're actually doing is corroborating each other's stories in the most spectacular way possible. He provides the prosecution with a detailed confession of the mechanics of the crime, the how, and she, in her attempt to prove she was the motive, gives them the why. Together they are happily filling in every blank for the district attorney. They have given the prosecution a perfect, detailed, and cross-referenced confession of their entire criminal partnership, all while trying to stab each other in the back. Any chance of a plea deal for leniency is gone. They have sealed each other's fates. I looked out the window of my hotel room at the endless river of traffic on the street below. Each car was its own separate world, its own story, moving in its own direction. Naomi and Trevor had for a time been traveling in the same car on the same road, heading for the same destination. But the moment the road had ended, they had not just gotten out and walked their separate ways. They had chosen, with a final vicious act of mutual destruction, to set the car on fire, with both of them still inside it. I had simply provided the match. They had done the rest of the work themselves. My weak whispered word, "okay," was the single crack that broke the dam. The manufactured tension in the room did not just ease, it burst, flooding the space with a wave of triumphant, almost giddy relief. Trevor, who had been a coiled spring of feigned anxiety, physically deflated. He collapsed back into the armchair he had sprung from, a long, whooshing sound of air escaping his lungs. He ran a hand through his hair, no longer a gesture of distress, but one of a marathon runner crossing the finish line. "Oh, Elias," he breathed, his voice thick with a gratitude so perfectly artificial it was almost more insulting than his lies. "Thank you. You don't know what this means. You saved us. You saved our lives." He was already recasting the narrative, positioning me not as the victim of their shakedown, but as the hero of their story. Naomi's reaction was even more stark. The desperate sobs that had racked her body ceased instantly, as if a switch had been flipped deep inside her. The raw panic in her eyes was replaced by a flicker of something else, pure, unadulterated victory. The look of a predator whose prey has finally blessedly stopped struggling. She squeezed my hands, which she was still holding, and her grip was no longer the desperate clutch of a scared child, but the firm, proprietary grip of an owner taking possession. "Oh, Daddy, I knew you would," she whispered, her voice still hoarse, a lingering echo of the part she had just played. "I knew you wouldn't let us down. You've always been our rock, a thing to be mined for its resources, a passive, unmoving feature of the landscape there to be exploited when needed." They began to talk at once, their voices overlapping in their excitement, the grim fantasy of violent loan sharks already a forgotten fiction. The immediate danger had passed, and now their minds, sharp and focused, turned to the more pleasant practical matter of logistics. How to transfer my entire life savings into their control as quickly and efficiently as possible. Okay, Trevor said, leaning forward in his chair, all business now. The desperate victim was gone, replaced by the sharp-shooting financial consultant. "We need a plan. How do we do this?" "The bank opens at 9. We'll need a cashier's check, I think. $600,000 is too much to withdraw in physical cash without pre-authorizing it, and we don't have time for that. A wire transfer might trigger a hold. The check is the cleanest way." He was thinking about the mechanics of the transfer, about the most efficient way to liquidate my future and possess it. There was no more talk of his mistake, no more shame or remorse. There was only the cold, hard problem of the transaction itself. I played my final necessary part in their drama. I made my voice sound weary, frail, defeated. "I'll have to call my broker David first thing in the morning." I said the words feeling like gravel in my mouth. "I'll have to tell him to liquidate the portfolio. It will take some time. There will be tax implications, Trevor. Capital gains, early withdrawal penalties from the retirement accounts." "Penalties," Naomi cut in her brow, furrowing with genuine, undisguised annoyance. The thought that there might be some cost, some friction in the process of acquiring my money was an unwelcome complication. Can't you just write a check from your account? The staggering naivety of the question, the sheer ignorance of how a lifetime of careful investment worked was a testament to the gilded cage I had foolishly built for her. She saw my entire financial world, a complex structure of stocks, bonds, and trusts built over 40 years, as nothing more than a simple checking account, a bottomless well from which she could draw at will. "It doesn't work like that, Naomi," I said gently, my voice a portrait of paternal patience. "This is a significant amount of money. It's tied up. It has to be sold first. The market has to open. The trades have to be executed. It takes time. A day, maybe two at the most." The mood in the room shifted again, becoming sharp and brittle. The relief was replaced by a new, more aggressive tension. My performance of weary resignation, my logistical reality, was now an obstacle to their goal. They had gotten the yes they wanted. Now they were impatient with the details. 2 days, Trevor said, his voice sharp, losing its grateful tone completely. "Elias, I told you. These people, they want their money tomorrow, at noon. There is no 2 days. That's not an option." "What am I supposed to do, Trevor?" I asked, my voice a perfect picture of helpless frustration. "I can't print the money. I have to call my broker. The markets have to open. The banks have to operate. This is the real world." Naomi stood up then. Her brief performance of the kneeling, pleading daughter was now a forgotten scene from a play that had reached its angry climax. She looked down at me. Her father, the man who had just, in theory, agreed to sacrifice his entire financial future to save her and her husband, and her expression was not one of gratitude. It was one of cold, hard impatience. She was a boss whose underling was making unacceptable excuses. "Daddy, that is not our problem," she said, her voice flat, cold, and utterly devoid of emotion. "That is your problem. You have to figure it out. You said you would help. This is what help looks like. It's not a 2-day process, it's a right-now process." She began to pace in front of me, a mirror of Trevor's earlier performance, but her agitation was not feigned. It was real. It was the agitation of a spoiled child whose every whim had not been instantly gratified. "Call your broker now," she commanded. "Wake him up. Tell him it's a life-or-death emergency. Tell him to be at the bank with the paperwork at 9 a.m. sharp. Tell him you'll pay whatever penalties there are. I don't care what you have to do. Get it done." The cruelty of it, the absolute lack of empathy for the monumental sacrifice she was demanding, was a physical blow. But the performance wasn't over. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment they would push too far. The moment they would make their demand so explicit, so unreasonable, so monstrously selfish that no one on earth, not a single person in a future jury box, could ever see them as the victims. I looked up at her, my face a carefully constructed mask of a father's pain. "Naomi," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "please, try to understand." But she was not speaking to her father anymore. She was speaking to her bank, and her account was overdrawn. She took a step closer, her face contorted with a rage that was terrifying in its purity. She pointed a finger at me, a gesture of such profound, shocking disrespect that it felt as if she had physically struck me. "I don't want to hear it," she snapped, her voice rising to a near shout. "I don't want to hear about your broker or your penalties or your process. You said you would handle it, so handle it. I need the money tomorrow." Trevor stood up, moving to stand beside her, a silent, menacing pillar of support for her tirade. He was no longer her husband. He was her enforcer. He looked down at me, his eyes as cold and dead as a shark's. "And no delays." He added, his voice a low, threatening growl that was meant to be the final, intimidating word. And there it was, the final naked demand. Not a request, but an order. Not a plea for help, but a threat. They were no longer pretending to be victims. They were robbers, and I was the mark. They had stripped away the last thin veneer of family and love, revealing the ugly transactional truth of their relationship with me. The forensic accountant in my mind made a final silent note. The demand, motive, absolute entitlement. The belief that my assets are their property. The crime is no longer the fraud committed against others. It is now an active attempt at extortion against me. I looked up at their faces, flushed with the righteousness of their own greed. I looked at my daughter's finger still pointing at me like a weapon. I looked at the man who had taught her to be this way. And in that moment, in the face of their absolute monstrous selfishness, I felt a profound and terrible peace. The last of my doubts, the last of my fatherly hesitations were burned away in the heat of their cruelty. They had given me the final piece of evidence I needed. They had given me the moral authority to do what had to be done. The father in me was finally truly dead, and the man who was left was simply a witness, a historian, and now a judge. The wheels of the federal justice system grind slowly, but as Charlie had predicted, they grind exceedingly fine. Months passed. The story of my daughter and her husband faded from the headlines, replaced by new scandals, new tragedies. Their case was moving through the labyrinthine corridors of the legal system, a slow, methodical process of pleas and depositions that I no longer had any part in. I had given my testimony. I had provided the truth. My role was over. But the consequences of their actions, I learned, were not confined to a courtroom. They were a poison that was still spreading through the lives of the people they had hurt. I found out the full extent of it during a meeting with Charlie in his office in the early spring. The winter had been long and cold, but the first hints of a thaw were in the air. "The bankruptcy trustee has finished his initial report, Elias," Charlie said, sliding a thin file across his polished mahogany desk. "It's what we expected. After they liquidate everything, the foreclosed house, the repossessed car, whatever pathetic assets they had left, and after the government and the lawyers take their substantial fees, the victims are going to be left with almost nothing." I opened the file. It was a list of the creditors, a long list, but my eyes went to two names near the top: Henderson, Abernathy. "What does almost nothing mean in real terms, Charlie?" I asked, my voice quiet. Charlie sighed a heavy, weary sound. 10 cents on the dollar. Maybe 15 if they're lucky. The Hendersons, they lost nearly $200,000, Elias. Their entire life savings. They're getting a check for $30,000. The Abernathys are in the same boat. They're not just hurt, my friend. They're wiped out. Their golden years, the security they worked their whole lives for. It's gone. Forever. I sat there in the expensive leather chair, the quiet of the high-rise office pressing in on me, and I felt a profound and sickening sense of responsibility. I was not legally responsible. The law was clear on that. My name was not on any of their fraudulent documents. I was a victim too, in a way, of their lies and their betrayal. But the law and a man's conscience are two different jurisdictions, and in the silent, unforgiving courtroom of my own heart, I knew that I was not without blame. Their crime had been committed under the shadow of my good name. They had used my reputation as a key to open the doors to our friend's trust. Trevor Hayes, the charming stranger, would never have gotten in the door. But Trevor Hayes, the son-in-law of Elias Vance, had been welcomed with open arms. And while I had not participated in the crime, I felt the stain of its consequences on my own soul. "I have the money from the sale of the big house," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "It's just sitting in a low-interest account. I don't need it. My pension is more than enough for the simple life I live now." Charlie looked at me, a cautious, wary expression on his face. "What are you thinking, Elias?" "I want to make them whole, Charlie," I said. Charlie sat back, stunned. "What are you talking about, Elias? You can't. The total deficit of the scheme is over $1 million. You can't just pay it all back." "Not all of it," I clarified. "Not the professional investors, the ones who should have known better, but the ones we know, our friends, the Hendersons, the Abernathys, the half-dozen other families from our church, from our old neighborhood, the ones who trusted Trevor because he was married to my daughter." I looked my old friend straight in the eye. "I want you to set up a restitution fund. We will quietly and anonymously, through a third-party trust, pay them back, every last penny they lost." Charlie stood up and began to pace, a gesture I knew meant he was deeply agitated. "Elias, that's insane," he said, his voice sharp with a lawyer's concern. "That's your retirement. That's your security. That's the money you were going to use to travel to enjoy your life. You have no legal obligation to do this. This is not your debt to pay. It is their crime, their punishment." "You're right," I said calmly. "It's not my legal debt, but it is my moral debt. What is security, Charlie? Is it a number in a bank account? Or is it the ability to look at yourself in the mirror in the morning without shame? Is it the ability to face your old friends, to look them in the eye, knowing you did everything in your power to make things right?" I thought of Rose, of her quiet, unshakable integrity. Rose and I built our lives on a foundation of honesty and responsibility. I continued, my voice now a low, passionate whisper. What good is my retirement if it's spent in a house haunted by the ghosts of the friends we failed to protect? This isn't about the law, Charlie. This is about balancing the ledger, not the financial ledger, the moral one. The Vance name was used to perpetrate a crime, and I will be damned if I don't use the last of the Vance resources to make it right. It's the only way to truly honor her legacy. Charlie stopped pacing. He stood in front of the window looking out at the city, his back to me. He was silent for a long time. When he finally turned around, the lawyer was gone, and only the friend remained. There was a look of profound, weary, and deep respect in his eyes. "You're a better man than I am, Elias Vance," he said quietly. "And Rose, she would have been so damn proud of you." "Then you'll help me do it?" I asked. He gave a single, slow nod. "I'll start drafting the trust documents this afternoon," he said, "anonymously as you requested. We'll make it right." As I left his office and stepped out into the bright spring afternoon, I felt a sense of lightness I had not felt in years. The weight of my daughter's crime, a weight I had not even been fully conscious of carrying, was finally being lifted. I had lost a fortune, the tangible result of a lifetime of hard work. But I was gaining something far more valuable in its place. I was buying back my family's honor. It was the most expensive check I would ever write, but it was the only one that ever truly bought me peace. A year has passed. The wheel of the seasons has turned, bringing another winter, another quiet blanket of snow over the city of Charlotte. But the world, my world, is a different place. I am no longer in the grand empty house that held the ghosts of a life that was. I am back in the small, sturdy bungalow that Rose and I built with our own hands all those years ago. The house is smaller. The rooms are fewer, but it feels more like a home than the other one ever did. Every corner holds an honest memory. Every creaking floorboard speaks of a life built on love, not on lies. I spend my days in the quiet company of my books and my wife's garden, now dormant under the snow, resting for the spring to come. The chaos of that night, the ugly, violent rupture of my family, feels like a scene from a history book, a distant, tragic chapter that is now thankfully in the past. Their trial concluded in the spring. Faced with the mountain of evidence I had provided, and with their own vicious competing testimonies that served only to confirm their mutual guilt, they had both in the end taken plea deals. Trevor, as the architect of the scheme, was sentenced to 12 years in a federal penitentiary. Naomi, for her role as a co-conspirator, received a sentence of 5 years. Their divorce had been finalized while they were both still in custody. The story was over. On the small oak table in my study, the same table where Charlie and I had laid out the evidence, there is now a different kind of paperwork. It is a stack of applications, each one a small story of hope and community. After the legal proceedings were over, I had sold the large family home. A portion of the money had been used to quietly and anonymously help make the victims of Trevor's scheme whole again. With the rest, I had established a small charitable foundation. It is called the Rose Vance Ethics Fund. Its mission is simple: to provide grants for financial literacy programs designed to protect senior citizens from the very kind of predators who had destroyed my daughter's life. I picked up the first application. It was from a community center in a low-income neighborhood on the west side of town. The director, a woman with a kind, tired face in her photograph, was requesting a small grant to fund a weekly seminar. "Our seniors," she wrote in a neat, careful hand, "are good, trusting people who have worked hard their entire lives. They are too often targeted by sophisticated scams that they don't understand. We want to empower them, to give them the tools to recognize the red flags, to ask the right questions, to protect the nest eggs they have fought so hard to build." Her proposed budget was for $2,000, enough to rent a small room, to print informational pamphlets, and to provide coffee and cookies for the attendees. It was a request born not of greed, but of genuine, heartfelt compassion. I thought of my daughter's and Trevor's demand: $500,000 by morning. I looked at this application for a few $1,000s that could change the lives of dozens of vulnerable people, and the contrast was so stark it took my breath away. This was the real work. This was the real legacy. I picked up the next application. It was from a retired school teacher who wanted to volunteer his time to create a simple, easy-to-understand website that would explain common financial scams in plain language. He wasn't asking for a salary, he was just asking for enough to cover the web hosting and design costs. If I can prevent just one person from losing their life savings to a predator, He wrote, "Then my retirement will have had a purpose." Purpose. That was the word. For the first time in a long, long time, I felt a sense of my own. My life was no longer defined by the failures of the past, but by the possibilities of the future. I had lost a daughter, a loss that would forever be a quiet ache in my heart. But I had found something else, a new family in a way. A family of decent, hard-working people who, like Rose, believed in the simple, powerful idea of helping others. I took out a fresh sheet of paper and my old fountain pen. I began to draft the approval letters. With each word I wrote, I felt the last of the shadows recede. I was no longer Elias Vance, the grieving father of a criminal. I was Elias Vance, the widower of Rose Vance and the proud administrator of her final, most important legacy. The house was quiet. The garden was resting. And my work, the real work, was just beginning. The sun is setting now, casting a long, warm, golden light across the garden. The air is cool and smells of damp earth and the sweet, spicy scent of Rose's heirloom flowers. I have the approved applications in a neat stack on the table in front of me, ready to be mailed in the morning. Each one represents a small act of defiance against the darkness, a small flicker of light in a world that can often seem overwhelmingly cynical. I find myself thinking about the word duty. For most of my life, I believed my duty as a father was to provide a safety net for my child, a soft place to land. I thought love meant protecting her from the world, from hardship, from the consequences of her own mistakes. I was the rock, the steady foundation she could always return to no matter what. But I was wrong. I was so profoundly, devastatingly wrong. Over the years, my safety net, woven with love and good intentions, had slowly, imperceptibly transformed. It was no longer a tool for her protection, it was a tool for her enablement. It didn't just catch her when she fell, it prevented her from ever learning how to stand on her own. And in the end, it became a trap, a comfortable hammock, where she could lie and dream while her husband used its ropes to strangle the futures of good, decent people. The hardest thing I ever had to do was not to uncover their crime, but to accept my role in it. My silence, my generosity, my unconditional financial support. It had all been the fertile soil in which their greed was allowed to grow. And I realized then that my true duty was not to protect my daughter from the fall that was coming. My duty was to be the one to cut the ropes. It was not an act of revenge. It was an act of love. A terrible, painful, and necessary kind of love. The kind of love that is willing to cause a deep, clean wound in the desperate hope that it might one day heal properly, rather than allowing a secret sickness to fester and rot from within. I had to become the instrument of her downfall, so she might finally have a chance to find her own moral footing to start building a life on the hard, firm ground of reality. For much of my life, I believed a father's love was a safety net designed to catch a child when they fall. Looking back now, I see my own mistakes clearly. I waited too long. I excused what should never have been excused. I told myself that love meant endurance, when, in truth, love also means limits. This family story taught me that silence can quietly enable harm, and that unchecked loyalty can turn into family betrayal before you even realize it. If I could give you one piece of advice, it would be this. Don't repeat my choices. Don't ignore the early warnings. Don't confuse sacrifice with surrender. A family story should be built on respect, not fear, and when respect is lost, family betrayal is never far behind. I learned this the hard way on my knees, praying to God for clarity. God reminded me that love does not require self-destruction. God showed me that accountability is not cruelty, it is truth. This family story didn't end with revenge, but with responsibility, and that is what finally brought peace. Because every family betrayal carries a lesson if we are brave enough to face it. If this family story resonated with you, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments, pass this story along to someone who might need it, and consider subscribing to the channel for more stories like this. Your support truly matters. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. And one final note, some upcoming stories include thoughtfully adapted elements created for educational purposes. If that's not something you're comfortable with, feel free to pause here and choose content that suits you better.